This is absolutely unacceptable. Do you people have any idea who I am? Victoria. Whitmore's voice sliced through the chaos of Boston Logan International Airport's Terminal C like a blade through silk. Her platinum blonde hair, stretched taut in a surgical facelift, trembled with rage as she jabbed a manicured finger at the exhausted gate agent behind the podium. The $80,000 Chanel coat draped across her shoulders caught the fluorescent light, casting shadows that made her appear even more formidable. Power doesn't announce itself, it simply exists. Victoria Whitmore never learned that lesson. December 24th, 2024. Christmas Eve. The blizzard outside had transformed New England into a white wasteland, burying runways under 6 inches of snow and counting. Inside Terminal C, the atmosphere crackled with the same volatile energy as the storm. The air smelled of stale coffee, wet wool, and mounting desperation. Flight delay announcements echoed through the terminal like funeral bells, each one crushing another family's Christmas morning dreams. Gate 15 had become ground zero for a perfect storm of privilege and pressure. The display board for Altitude Airlines Flight 847 to Denver flickered ominously. Delayed. Standing at the front of the first-class priority boarding lane, tapping a manicured nail against her platinum iPhone case, was Victoria Whitmore. Victoria was 55, though her plastic surgeon would swear in court she was 42. She wore a lynx fur coat that cost more than most people's cars, and on her arm hung a limited-edition Hermes Birkin bag, the leather distinctively pebbled and unmistakably genuine. She was the kind of woman who didn't just occupy space, she annexed it. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Victoria snapped. Not to anyone in particular, but loud enough that the gate agents behind the podium flinched. "My husband, Richard Bancroft." Perhaps you've heard of Bancroft Pharmaceuticals, paid $7,000 for this ticket. "If I don't get to the Ritz-Carlton Bachelor Gulch by midnight, heads are going to roll." The gate agent, a tired man named David Rodriguez with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of 16-hour shifts during the holiday rush, forced a smile. "I apologize, Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft. The de-icing crew is working as fast as they can. Weather conditions are still challenging." "I don't care about weather conditions," Victoria interrupted, adjusting her oversized Dior sunglasses despite being indoors. "I care about results. Fix it." She turned away from the podium, her eyes scanning the gate area like a radar system searching for targets. The delayed flight had created an uncomfortable mixing of social classes. First-class passengers who usually enjoyed private lounges were now forced to share space with economy travelers. Victoria's face twisted with distaste as she observed the scene. That's when her gaze landed on the bench directly across from the first-class boarding lane. Sitting there, almost invisible against the backdrop of designer luggage and luxury travel gear, was a young woman who looked like she belonged in a different terminal entirely. Maybe a different airport altogether. The contrast was jarring. In a sea of Prada and Gucci, she wore a simple, oversized gray hoodie that had seen better years. Her black leggings were paired with worn sneakers that told stories of long walks and longer days. She was typing furiously on a cracked iPad, a pair of large, noise-canceling headphones around her neck. She looked exhausted, almost invisible against the backdrop of glitz that usually accompanied the Aspen flight crowd. Victoria's eyes narrowed as she studied the girl. Early 20s. African-American hair pulled back in a messy bun that suggested either exhaustion or indifference to appearance. To Victoria's calculating mind, the girl looked like a vagrant who had wandered into the wrong part of the airport. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Altitude Airlines is now ready to begin boarding Flight 847 to Denver. We invite our first-class passengers and Diamond Medallion members to board at this time." The announcement sent a ripple of movement through the gate area. Victoria immediately lunged forward, her heels clicking against the terminal floor like gunshots. But the girl in the gray hoodie stood up at exactly the same moment. Zara Williams gathered her simple backpack, slung it over one shoulder, and stepped into the first-class boarding lane right in front of Victoria. Victoria stopped dead in her tracks. The audacity. Zara Williams was 26 years old, though the weight she carried in her shoulders made her appear both younger and older simultaneously. The hoodie she wore wasn't just any piece of clothing, it was a Stanford University sweatshirt worn soft from years of wear. The sleeves were pushed up, revealing hands that spoke of both privilege and work. Her father's hands. 3 weeks ago, Zara had been a recent Stanford MBA graduate working in strategy consulting, living a carefully planned life that balanced her business acumen with her desire to honor her father's legacy. 2 weeks ago, she had stood in a cemetery watching dirt fall onto the casket of the only parent she'd ever known. 1 week ago, she had sat in a boardroom as lawyers read a will that changed her life forever. Today, she was the majority owner and interim CEO of Altitude Airlines. But nobody in this terminal knew that. Looking at her now, in her father's old college hoodie and jeans that had seen too many sleepless nights, she appeared to be exactly what Victoria assumed a young woman trying to fly above her station. The backpack Zara carried was worn leather, another inheritance from her father Marcus Williams. Inside it was her laptop, some legal documents that would reshape the airline industry, and a leather-bound journal where her father had written his philosophies about business dignity and treating every human being with respect regardless of their appearance or station in life. Zara had been reading that journal for weeks, trying to understand how to fill shoes that seemed impossibly large. Her father had built Altitude Airlines from nothing, founding it on the principle that air travel should be dignified for everyone, not just the wealthy. He had died too young, too suddenly, leaving behind a company worth $2 billion and a daughter who was still learning how to carry his vision forward. The exhaustion in Zara's posture wasn't just from travel. It was grief responsibility and the weight of expectations pressing down on her 26-year-old shoulders. She was flying commercial today instead of taking the company's private jet because she wanted to experience the airline from a passenger's perspective. She wanted to understand what her father had built from the ground up. She had no idea she was about to receive a masterclass in exactly why her father's principles mattered. "Excuse me, Victoria," said her voice sharp and loud, cutting through the ambient noise of the terminal like a knife. "Excuse me. I'm talking to you." Zara stopped and turned around. She pulled her headphones down, her expression calm but confused. The noise-canceling headphones were a recent purchase, a necessary tool for blocking out the sound of her own grief during the lonely nights when she couldn't sleep. "Yes." Zara's voice was quiet, measured. She had learned from her father that volume didn't equal authority. "You're in the wrong line, dear," Victoria said, offering a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was a smile made of shark teeth and surgical precision. "This is priority boarding, first class only. Economy boarding is Group 4. You need to wait over there with the rest of the—" Victoria gestured vaguely toward the crowded general seating area. Crowd. Around them, other passengers began to take notice. The delayed flight had created a pressure cooker atmosphere, and confrontation was like oxygen to flames. Miguel Santos, a 34-year-old tech entrepreneur from San Jose, looked up from his phone where he had been scrolling through Twitter. Miguel had built his software company from the ground up, and he had a sixth sense for recognizing when power dynamics were about to explode. His hand moved instinctively toward his phone's camera function. Rachel Martinez, a 22-year-old college student from the University of Denver, was already live-streaming her travel delays to her TikTok followers. She had nearly 50,000 followers who tuned in for her daily life content, and she could smell viral content from a mile away. Her camera was already rolling. David Cohen, a 43-year-old divorce attorney from Boston, glanced up from his legal documents. 30 years of practice had taught him to recognize discrimination when he saw it. His experienced eye immediately cataloged the interaction older white woman of obvious wealth targeting younger black woman based on appearance alone. textbook bias. Sarah Thompson, a 52-year-old retired high school teacher from Maine, had spent 3 decades dealing with bullying in all its forms. She recognized the patterns immediately: the public humiliation, the coded language, the assumption of superiority. Her teacher instincts were already activating. None of these witnesses knew they were about to document one of the most significant moments in aviation history. Zara looked at Victoria, really looked at her for the first time. There was no anger in Zara's eyes, only a deep, settling fatigue. She had buried her father 2 weeks ago. She had spent the last week in boardrooms fighting for control of a company that employed 45,000 people. She was flying to Denver to attend her first Christmas alone in 26 years. She didn't have the energy for this. "I know I'm in the right place," Zara said quietly, turning back toward the gate agent. Victoria's face went crimson. She wasn't used to being ignored. She wasn't used to having her authority questioned, especially not by someone who looked like they couldn't afford a first-class ticket if they saved for a decade. The terminal around them buzzed with the specific energy that comes when hundreds of people are trapped together by circumstances beyond their control. Christmas Eve at Boston. Logan was always chaotic, but the blizzard had transformed normal holiday travel stress into something approaching desperation. Gate 15 sat in the heart of Terminal C's luxury section, where Altitude Airlines operated its premium routes. The gate area was designed to accommodate the airline's affluent clientele, leather seating charging stations at every seat, and a subtle but unmistakable sense of exclusivity. The boarding area was clearly divided first class and diamond medallion passengers on the right, everyone else on the left. The storm outside had been building for hours. Through the massive windows, passengers could see the tarmac disappearing under waves of snow. De-icing trucks moved like yellow beetles across the white landscape, their lights cutting through the darkness of the late afternoon sky. The meteorologists were calling it the storm of the decade, a nor'easter that was rewriting Christmas travel plans across the entire eastern seaboard. Inside the terminal, the delayed flight had created an uncomfortable social mixing. First-class passengers who would normally wait in private lounges were forced to share space with families clutching economy tickets. The usual invisible barriers between classes had been temporarily dissolved by the weather, creating a pressure cooker where different worlds collided. Victoria Whitmore-Bancroft represented everything that Altitude Airlines founder Marcus Williams had built his company to challenge. She was old money wrapped in new surgical enhancements, the kind of passenger who believed that wealth was proof of worth. Her presence in the gate area was performative, every gesture designed to remind everyone around her of the gulf between their stations in life. The pharmaceutical fortune that funded Victoria's lifestyle came with its own complications. Her husband Richard's companies were currently under federal investigation for price-fixing insulin, a fact that Victoria preferred to ignore, but that added an edge of desperation to her usual entitled behavior. This Denver trip wasn't just a Christmas vacation, it was a strategic retreat to meet with lawyers and public relations specialists about managing the growing scandal. The irony was lost on Victoria that she was flying on an airline founded by a man who had built his fortune by treating people with dignity rather than exploiting their needs. The gate agent, David Rodriguez, had been working for Altitude Airlines for 8 years. He had been personally hired by Marcus Williams during the company's expansion into Boston, and he remembered the founder's words during orientation. "Every passenger who steps onto our aircraft is someone's child, parent, or sibling. Treat them accordingly." David had seen his share of difficult passengers, but the combination of Christmas Eve stress, weather delays, and entitled affluence was creating a perfect storm. He could feel the tension building as Victoria's voice carried across the gate area, and he could see other passengers starting to pay attention. The atmosphere in the terminal was electric, with more than just storm energy. Social media was omnipresent. Nearly every passenger under 30 had a phone out, documenting their travel delays, sharing their frustration, looking for content that might break through the noise of a million other stranded travelers. Miguel Santos had built his tech company by understanding how information traveled in the digital age. He recognized that moments of human conflict had the potential to explode across social platforms, especially when those conflicts revealed uncomfortable truths about society. His finger hovered over his phone's record button. Rachel Martinez had grown up understanding that everything was content. Her generation had been raised on viral videos, and she had developed an instinct for recognizing when ordinary moments were about to become extraordinary. Her TikTok was already live broadcasting to followers who were eager for drama to break up their own holiday monotony. The terminal's architecture seemed designed to amplify conflict. The open spaces and hard surfaces created an acoustic environment where conversations carried farther than intended. Victoria's voice, already pitched to command attention, echoed across the gate area like an announcement. Other passengers were beginning to notice. A family with 3 young children looked up from their tablets. An elderly couple paused their quiet conversation. Business travelers glanced over their laptops. The gate area was transforming from a collection of individual travelers into an audience. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside Terminal C a different kind of storm was building. The kind that happened when assumption met reality, when privilege collided with principle, and when the wrong person picked the wrong target on the wrong day. Altitude Airlines Flight 847 sat on the tarmac like a sleeping giant, its wings being methodically cleared of ice by ground crews who worked with the precision of surgeons. The Boeing 787 was one of the airline's newer aircraft, designed with the luxury amenities that had made Altitude a preferred carrier for business and leisure travelers who could afford premium experiences. The aircraft's first-class cabin featured only 12 seats, each one a private pod that converted to a fully flat bed. Seat 1A was the most coveted position on the plane, a bulkhead window seat that offered both privacy and the best views. It was also the seat that Marcus Williams had always preferred when he flew on his own aircraft, though he had often given it up to passengers celebrating anniversaries, honeymoons, or other special occasions. Today, that seat belonged to his daughter. But Victoria Whitmore-Bancroft didn't know that. All she saw was a young black woman in casual clothes standing in a line where Victoria believed she didn't belong. The boarding line began to move forward as David Rodriguez started processing first-class passengers. Victoria stepped around Zara, physically blocking her path to the scanner. Victoria shrieked at the gate agent, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having service workers scramble at her command. "Check her ticket right now. This person is blocking the line and harassing actual paying customers." The word "actual" hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, conversation stopped. Phones turned toward the confrontation. The delayed flight had already frayed everyone's nerves, and conflict was magnetic. David looked uncomfortable. In his 8 years with Altitude Airlines, he had developed a finely tuned sense for when situations were about to spiral out of control. He looked at Zara, then at his computer screen, then back at Victoria. "Ma'am," he said to Victoria, "please step back so I can assist all passengers." "Check her ticket," Victoria demanded, slamming her hand on the counter. The sound echoed through the gate area like a gunshot. Zara sighed quietly. She had hoped to board peacefully, to settle into seat 1A and spend the flight reading her father's journal and preparing for the difficult conversations that waited in Denver. Instead, she was becoming the center of a spectacle that was already attracting an audience. She reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out her boarding pass. The paper was slightly crumpled from being carried in her pocket, but the printing was clear. First class seat 1A, Williams Z. She handed it to David without a word. David scanned the ticket. The machine let out a pleasant ping. A green light flashed on his screen, followed by something that made his eyebrows raise slightly. The passenger information showed more than just a boarding pass. It showed a VIP designation that he had only seen a few times in his career. The kind of designation reserved for airline executives, board members, and family. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Williams." David said, his voice carrying a new note of respect that he couldn't quite hide. "You're in seat 1A. Please enjoy your flight." Victoria froze. Seat 1A. The bulkhead window seat. The best seat on the plane. The seat that the system had told her was blocked for VIP allocation when she had tried to book it weeks ago. "That's impossible," Victoria hissed as Zara walked past her toward the jet bridge. VIP. "She looks like she cleans the VIP lounge, not sits in it." David handed Victoria her own boarding pass, his patience visibly evaporating. "Please board the aircraft, Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft. You're holding up the line." Victoria snatched her ticket, seething. She stormed down the jet bridge, her designer heels clicking against the metal flooring like machine gun fire. The sound echoed through the enclosed space, announcing her approach to everyone within earshot. She wasn't letting this go. No one humiliated Victoria Whitmore-Bancroft, especially not someone wearing sneakers that looked like they had walked through half of Boston. As she marched toward the aircraft, Victoria pulled out her phone and fired off a text to her husband Nightmare at airport. Having to deal with unsuitable passengers in first class. Going to handle it personally. Love you. She had no idea that she was walking into a confrontation that would destroy her life and change an entire industry. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the jet bridge, a different kind of storm was about to begin. The interior of Altitude Airlines Flight 847 was a sanctuary of understated luxury. The first-class cabin featured 12 private suites arranged in a 1-to-1 configuration, each seat upholstered in butter-soft Italian leather the color of champagne. Ambient lighting painted the cabin in warm golden tones, and soft jazz drifted from hidden speakers, creating an atmosphere that whispered rather than shouted its exclusivity. Zara had already settled into seat 1A, the bulkhead window position that offered the most privacy on the aircraft. She had placed her worn backpack in the seat's storage compartment and kicked off her sneakers, revealing mismatched socks, one gray, one navy, that somehow made her appear even younger than her 26 years. She pulled a cashmere throw blanket over her legs, a small luxury that her father had always insisted upon during their flights together. Marcus Williams had believed that comfort shouldn't be ostentatious, that true luxury was about feeling at home 30,000 feet above the earth. Zara was trying to make herself invisible, to disappear into the oversized seat and process the grief that still caught her at unexpected moments. In her hands was her father's leather journal, its pages filled with his thoughts about leadership, dignity, and the responsibility that came with power. She had been reading it every day since his funeral, trying to understand how to fill shoes that seemed impossibly large. The journal entry she was reading had been written 5 years earlier during Altitude's expansion into international routes. Today, I watched a gate agent in Frankfurt treat an elderly passenger with such patience and kindness that it reminded me why we do this work. Every interaction is an opportunity to prove that dignity isn't a luxury item. It's a basic human right that should come standard with every ticket. Zara's finger traced the words as the boarding door closed behind another passenger. She could hear footsteps approaching, the sharp click of expensive heels against the aircraft's flooring. She didn't look up. Victoria Whitmore-Bancroft appeared in the first-class cabin like a storm front, her presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from peaceful to electric. She had been assigned seat 2A, directly behind Zara, but her eyes were locked on the young woman occupying what Victoria considered the prime real estate of the aircraft. Victoria's seat was identical to Zara's in every way except location. Same leather, same amenities, same level of luxury. But Victoria had spent her entire adult life believing that proximity to privilege was itself a form of privilege. Being in row 2 instead of row 1 felt like a demotion, especially when row 1 was occupied by someone who, in Victoria's mind, had no business being there. "Excuse me," Victoria said, her voice cutting through the cabin's peaceful ambiance like a blade. "I think there's been some kind of mistake." Zara looked up from her father's journal, her expression calm but questioning. "I'm sorry I tried to book seat 1A weeks ago." Victoria continued, her voice carrying across the first-class cabin. "The system said it was blocked for VIP allocation. I paid $7,000 for this ticket, and I don't understand how someone—" She paused. her eyes taking in Zara's hoodie and jeans with obvious disapproval. How someone dressed like that managed to get the best seat on the plane. The other first-class passengers began to take notice. A businessman in seat 3B lowered his Wall Street Journal. An elderly woman in 4A looked up from her iPad. The cabin, which moments before had been filled with the quiet murmur of settled passengers, now buzzed with tension. Sandra Mills, the lead flight attendant, approached from the galley. Sandra was a 15-year veteran of Altitude Airlines, handpicked by Marcus Williams for her ability to handle difficult situations with grace. She had worked directly with the company's founder on developing the airline's service standards, and she knew that every passenger interaction was a reflection of the company's values. "Is everything all right here?" Sandra asked, her voice professionally pleasant, but with an undertone that suggested she was prepared for trouble. "No, everything is not all right," Victoria snapped. "I want to know how the seating assignment was made. I want to know why I'm in row 2 when clearly there was some kind of error with the passenger in row 1. Sandra glanced at Zara, who had returned to reading her journal, then back at Victoria. "Ma'am, all seating assignments are confirmed through our reservation system. If you'd like to review your ticket, I'd be happy to." "I don't want to review my ticket," Victoria interrupted. "I want to review her ticket, because I guarantee you that someone made a mistake or someone is flying on a ticket they didn't pay for." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Around the cabin, other passengers stopped their conversations entirely. Phones appeared as travelers began documenting what was clearly becoming a confrontation. Miguel Santos, seated in 3A, had his phone out and recording within seconds. His tech entrepreneur instincts told him that he was witnessing something that would transcend typical passenger conflict. The dynamics at play, race class assumption versus reality, had all the elements of a story that could explode across social media. Rachel Martinez, who had managed to upgrade to first class using points, was already live streaming from seat 4B. Her TikTok followers were watching in real time as the situation developed, and the comment section was lighting up with reactions. "Y'all, this Karen is really about to harass this girl over a seat," Rachel whispered to her phone. "This is wild. This is literally happening right now." Zara finally looked up from her journal, her eyes meeting Victoria's directly. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried a weight that seemed to still the entire cabin. "I paid for my ticket," Zara said simply. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Victoria's face flushed red. "You paid for it with what?" The question was loaded with implication, dripping with the kind of coded language that made assumptions about worth based on appearance. The cabin fell silent except for the ambient hum of the aircraft systems. Sandra Mills stepped forward, her professional composure beginning to show cracks. In 15 years of flying, she had never heard a passenger question another passenger's right to be on the aircraft so directly. "Ma'am," Sandra said to Victoria, "I'm going to need you to take your seat so we can begin our safety demonstration. I will take my seat when someone explains to me how a girl who looks like she's flying on a charity ticket ended up in the most expensive seat on this plane." Victoria shot back. The words "charity ticket" echoed through the first-class cabin like a slap. Multiple passengers gasped audibly. Phones that had been discreetly recording were now openly pointed at the confrontation. Zara closed her father's journal slowly and placed it in her lap. When she stood up, there was something in her movement that commanded attention. She wasn't tall, barely 5'6", but there was a presence about her that seemed to fill the space around her. "Ma'am," Zara said, her voice still quiet, but now carrying an edge that hadn't been there before, "you have a problem with me sitting here. But your problem isn't with the seat assignment. Your problem is with me." Victoria stepped closer, invading Zara's personal space. "You're right. My problem is with you. People like you don't belong in first class, and everyone on this plane knows it." The confrontation had crossed a line from passenger dispute to something much more dangerous. Sandra Mills reached for the phone that connected her directly to the cockpit, while other passengers documented every word. Neither Victoria nor Zara knew that this moment would become the most watched airline incident in aviation history. Neither of them knew that the words being spoken in this first-class cabin would trigger changes that would reshape an entire industry. But Captain Elena Vasquez, monitoring the situation from the cockpit, was beginning to understand that Flight 847 was about to become much more than a delayed Christmas Eve departure. The first-class cabin of Flight 847 had transformed from a space of quiet luxury into an amphitheater where assumptions and reality were about to collide with devastating force. Every passenger in the cabin was now paying attention, their holiday travel plans forgotten in the face of unfolding drama. Miguel Santos had seen enough workplace discrimination in Silicon Valley to recognize the patterns immediately. His phone was steady in his hands as he captured every word, every gesture, every micro-expression that crossed both women's faces. His software company specialized in bias detection algorithms, and he was watching a textbook case of prejudice unfold in real time. "This is exactly why representation matters," Miguel whispered to his recording. "Watch how this woman assumes that a young black woman couldn't possibly afford first class." His live stream had already attracted 3,000 viewers, and the number was climbing rapidly. Rachel Martinez's TikTok audience had exploded to over 15,000 live viewers, her comment section scrolling too fast to read. Her generation had grown up witnessing viral moments of discrimination, and she had developed an instinct for recognizing when ordinary conflict was about to become extraordinary social commentary. "Chat, this is insane," Rachel whispered to her phone. "This woman literally just said people like you don't belong in first class to a passenger, like she said that out loud. With cameras rolling, I cannot even." David Cohen, the divorce attorney, had set down his legal briefs entirely. 30 years of practice had taught him to recognize when situations were escalating toward the kind of confrontation that ended up in courtrooms. He began taking notes on his phone, documenting times and exact quotes with the precision of someone who understood that words had consequences. "This is harassment," David said quietly to the passenger next to him, making sure his voice carried across the cabin. "What we're witnessing is textbook harassment based on racial assumptions. This woman is creating a hostile environment." Sarah Thompson, the retired teacher, felt every protective instinct she had developed over 3 decades of education activating at once. She had seen too many young people targeted by bullies who used coded language to make their attacks sound reasonable. The pattern was always the same: isolate the target, question their right to be present, and escalate until they either fought back or retreated. "Honey," Sarah said, standing up from her seat and addressing Zara directly, "you don't owe anyone an explanation for being here. You paid for your ticket just like everyone else." Victoria whirled toward Sarah, her fury now expanding beyond her original target. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns all of us," Sarah replied, her teacher voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades managing classroom conflicts. "We're all witnessing inappropriate behavior, and we all have a responsibility to speak up." The cabin was now fully engaged. Other passengers had stopped pretending not to watch and were openly observing the confrontation. The businessman in 3B had his phone out. The elderly woman in 4A was shaking her head in disapproval. Even passengers in the business class cabin behind them were craning their necks to see what was happening. Sandra Mills, the lead flight attendant, was caught in an impossible position. Company policy required her to maintain order in the cabin, but she was watching one passenger openly harass another based on nothing more than appearance and assumption. Her training told her to de-escalate, but her conscience was telling her to protect Zara from increasingly personal attacks. Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft, Sandra said, using Victoria's full name with deliberate emphasis, "I need you to return to your assigned seat immediately. Your behavior is disrupting other passengers." "My behavior?" Victoria's voice rose to a near shriek. "My behavior is asking legitimate questions about how seating assignments are made. My behavior is protecting the integrity of the first-class experience that I paid premium prices to enjoy." Miguel's phone captured every word. Did she just say integrity of the first-class experience, he whispered to his audience. Like she really just said that a black woman's presence diminishes the value of her ticket. This is 2024, y'all. This is happening right now. Rachel's live stream chat was exploding with reactions. Karen alert! Someone get this girl's name. Protect her at all costs. This is about to be everywhere. The social media machinery was already churning. Miguel's Twitter post had been retweeted hundreds of times. Rachel's TikTok had been shared across Instagram and Snapchat. David Cohen was preparing to share the incident with his legal network. Sarah Thompson was texting her daughter, who worked in civil rights advocacy. But none of the witnesses knew the most important fact of all. They were documenting the harassment of the woman who owned the airline. Victoria continued her attack, unaware that every word was being broadcast to thousands of people. "I want to see her boarding pass. I want to see proof that she didn't just walk onto this plane and take whatever seat she wanted." Zara remained standing, her father's journal still in her hands. She looked around the cabin at the faces of the passengers who were watching, some with sympathy, some with horror, all of them documenting the moment when privilege revealed its true face. "You want to see my boarding pass?" Zara asked quietly. "Yes," Victoria snapped. "I want to see exactly what you paid for that seat." Zara reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out the slightly crumpled boarding pass. She handed it to Sandra Mills, who scanned it with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she would find. The machine beeped. The screen displayed information that made Sandra's eyes widen slightly. "Miss Williams." Sandra said, her voice carrying a new note of respect that she couldn't hide. "Your seat assignment is confirmed. Is there anything else I can do to make you comfortable?" Victoria froze. The emphasis in Sandra's voice was unmistakable. Something had changed, but Victoria couldn't understand what. She was about to find out. 3 weeks earlier, Zara Williams had been living a carefully constructed life in Palo Alto, working as a strategy consultant for McKinsey & Company, and slowly building the experience she would need to eventually join her father's airline empire. She had always known that Altitude Airlines would be part of her future, but Marcus Williams had insisted that his daughter earn her place through merit rather than inheritance. "The airline business isn't about privilege," Marcus had told her during their last conversation. "It's about service. Every decision you make affects real people, trying to get home to their families, trying to attend funerals, trying to celebrate weddings, trying to build lives. Never forget that behind every seat is a human story." The call had come on December 3rd at 2:47 a.m. Pacific Time. Marcus Williams, 58 years old, founder and CEO of Altitude Airlines, had suffered a massive heart attack in his Denver office. He had been working late reviewing safety reports and employee satisfaction surveys when his heart simply stopped. The paramedics found him at his desk, his computer screen still displaying an email to the company's board about expanding their scholarship program for underprivileged students pursuing aviation careers. Zara had taken the red-eye flight from San Francisco to Denver that night, still wearing her consultation clothes from a client meeting, still carrying the presentation materials that suddenly seemed completely irrelevant. She spent the flight staring out the window at clouds that looked like cotton balls, trying to process the reality that the most important person in her life was gone. The funeral had been a study in contradictions. Thousands of Altitude Airlines employees had attended, from pilots and flight attendants to mechanics and gate agents. They shared stories about a CEO who remembered their names, who had paid for their children's college tuitions, who had personally called them when family members were sick. But there were also powerful figures from across the aviation industry, competitors who respected Marcus Williams for changing how airlines treated both employees and passengers. Zara had stood at the podium wearing a black dress that her father had never seen, reading a eulogy that felt inadequate for capturing a man who had revolutionized air travel by treating it as a human service rather than a commodity transport business. My father believed that every person who stepped onto an altitude aircraft was someone's most precious cargo, she had said, her voice carrying across a packed Denver cathedral. He built this company on the principle that dignity isn't a luxury, it's a requirement. The reading of the will had taken place 1 week later in the same Denver office where Marcus had died. Zara sat across from a conference table filled with lawyers, board members, and executives who had helped build Altitude Airlines into a $3.2 billion company. The leather chair at the head of the table, her father's chair, remained empty. The will was straightforward in its complexity. Marcus Williams had left his daughter 78% of Altitude Airlines, making her not just the majority shareholder, but the controlling owner of an airline that employed 45,000 people and served 150 destinations across 6 continents. The remaining 22% was divided among employee stock ownership plans and charitable foundations focused on education and transportation access. But ownership came with conditions. Zara would assume the role of interim CEO immediately, but she would need to prove herself to the board of directors over the course of a year. If the board voted no confidence in her leadership, the controlling stake would transfer to a trust managed by the company's senior executives until she turned 35. Your father wanted to ensure that leadership was earned, not inherited, the lead attorney had explained. He believed you were ready for this responsibility, but he also believed that leadership without accountability was just privilege wearing a business suit. The hoodie Zara wore on Flight 847 had belonged to Marcus Williams during his undergraduate years at Stanford, where he had studied engineering before dropping out to start a small charter airline with borrowed money and unwavering determination. Zara had found it in his Denver apartment while sorting through his personal belongings, and she had been wearing it almost daily since the funeral. It smelled like his cologne and carried the weight of his dreams. The backpack she carried contained more than just personal items. Inside was her laptop with financial projections for Altitude's next 5 years, legal documents outlining her plans for company expansion, and a detailed proposal for an industry-wide anti-discrimination protocol that she had been developing since taking over the company. She was flying to Denver, not for a Christmas vacation, but to attend her first major board meeting as CEO, where she would present her vision for the airline's future. The worn sneakers on her feet had walked the halls of Altitude's Denver headquarters for the past week as she learned the business from the ground up. She had spent time in the maintenance hangars, the customer service call centers, and the crew lounges. She had listened to gate agents describe difficult passengers and flight attendants share stories about medical emergencies at 35,000 feet. She had reviewed safety reports and customer feedback surveys until her eyes burned. What she had discovered was that her father's principles weren't just philosophy. They were the foundation of a corporate culture that treated employees as family and passengers as honored guests. Altitude Airlines had the highest employee satisfaction ratings in the industry and the lowest rate of passenger complaints. The company's financial success was built on the radical idea that treating people well was actually profitable. But Zara had also discovered troubling patterns in the incident reports. Stories of passengers being questioned about their right to be in first class based on their appearance. Gate agents making assumptions about who could afford premium tickets. Subtle discrimination that rarely made it into official reports, but that created a hostile environment for travelers who didn't fit traditional expectations of wealth. The journal she carried everywhere contained her father's thoughts about these very issues. Marcus Williams had written extensively about the challenge of maintaining company values as the business grew, about the difficulty of ensuring that every employee understood that dignity wasn't negotiable, about his fear that success might compromise the principles that had made success possible. One entry written just 2 months before his death read, Today, I watched a gate agent in Miami question a young Hispanic woman's right to board first class despite her having a valid ticket and diamond status. The agent apologized when I intervened, but I realized that my presence shouldn't be required for basic human decency. We need stronger protocols, better training, and clearer consequences for discrimination. A company's values aren't what its CEO believes, they're what happens when the CEO isn't watching. Zara had underlined that passage multiple times. She had been planning to discuss it with her father after the holidays. Instead, she was now responsible for implementing the changes he had envisioned for ensuring that Altitude Airlines remained true to its founding principles even as it grew into one of the world's largest carriers. She had chosen to fly commercial on Flight 847 because she wanted to experience the airline as a regular passenger to see whether her father's values were still evident at ground level. She had deliberately dressed casually to test whether the company's commitment to dignity extended to passengers who didn't look like traditional first-class travelers. She was about to receive a devastating education in exactly how far the company still had to go. Victoria Whitmore-Bancroft's life had been carefully constructed around the principle that wealth was proof of worth, and worth was demonstrated through the systematic exclusion of those deemed inferior. At 48, she had never held a job, never earned a paycheck, never created anything of value for the world. Her existence was entirely parasitic, feeding off her husband's pharmaceutical fortune while contributing nothing but social toxicity. She had been born Victoria Hartwell to a moderately wealthy Connecticut family that had made their money in textiles during the Industrial Revolution and had been slowly losing it ever since. Her childhood had been spent in prep schools where she learned that class was something you performed rather than earned, where she absorbed the lessons that would shape her adult personality. Appearance mattered more than achievement. Connections were more valuable than competence, and the right to exclude others was the ultimate expression of power. Her marriage to Richard Whitmore-Bancroft had been a transaction disguised as romance. Richard needed a socially connected wife to legitimize his nouveau riche pharmaceutical fortune. Victoria needed a wealthy husband to maintain the lifestyle she believed she deserved. Neither had ever pretended the arrangement was based on love, but both had honored its terms for 15 years of mutually beneficial exploitation. Richard's pharmaceutical empire was built on a foundation that would have horrified Victoria if she had possessed the moral capacity for horror. His companies specialized in acquiring patents for life-saving medications and then raising prices to maximize profits. Insulin EpiPen's cancer medications. If people needed it to survive, Richard found ways to make them pay more for it. The federal investigation that currently threatened their lifestyle had started 6 months earlier when a congressional committee began examining price manipulation in the pharmaceutical industry. Richard's companies were accused of coordinating with competitors to artificially inflate prices, creating a cartel that treated human desperation as a profit center. Victoria's reaction to the investigation had been typical of her personality. She was angry not because her husband was potentially ruining lives, but because the investigation was inconveniencing her social calendar. Country clubs were beginning to distance themselves from the Bancroft name. Charity boards were quietly suggesting that she might want to step down from her positions. The exclusive social circles that had defined her identity were closing their doors. This Christmas trip to Denver wasn't a vacation, it was a strategic retreat. Richard was meeting with criminal defense attorneys and public relations specialists to manage the growing crisis. Victoria was supposed to be meeting with wealth management consultants to discuss moving their assets offshore beyond the reach of potential criminal asset forfeiture. The stress of potentially losing everything had turned Victoria's natural meanness into something approaching sociopathy. She had always looked down on people she considered beneath her, but now she was lashing out at anyone who reminded her of her own vulnerability. The young black woman in the hoodie represented everything that Victoria's fragile ego couldn't tolerate: youth authenticity, and the audacity to exist in spaces where Victoria believed only people like herself belonged. Victoria's history was littered with incidents like this one. 3 months earlier, she had called the police on a Hispanic family having a birthday party in the public park near her Hamptons estate, claiming they were creating a disturbance when their only crime was existing while non-white in her field of vision. The incident had been recorded by other park visitors and had briefly gone viral on local social media before being forgotten in the endless stream of similar incidents. 2 years ago, she had demanded that a young black woman be ejected from the first-class lounge at Miami International Airport, insisting that the woman was using someone else's membership card. The woman had turned out to be a federal judge, and Victoria had been quietly banned from the lounge network for a year. Last Christmas, she had complained to the management of the St. Regis Aspen about inappropriate guests in the hotel bar, referring to a group of young tech entrepreneurs who happened to be Asian American. The entrepreneurs had been part of a venture capital conference and were worth a combined $500 million. But Victoria's complaint wasn't about their wealth, it was about their race. Each incident followed the same pattern. Victoria would identify someone who didn't match her expectations of who deserved to share her space. She would escalate the confrontation until it became public, and then she would either retreat when faced with consequences or double down when she encountered resistance. What made this incident different was that Victoria was stressed beyond her usual ability to calculate social risk. The federal investigation had shaken her confidence in the armor of privilege that had protected her throughout her adult life. For the first time, she was facing the possibility that money might not be enough to shield her from consequences. The young woman in Seat 1A represented everything that Victoria's worldview couldn't accommodate: someone who belonged in first class despite not looking like Victoria's mental image of a first-class passenger. The cognitive dissonance was too much for Victoria's fragile ego to process, so she did what she always did when reality contradicted her prejudices: she attacked. Victoria's arsenal of coded language had been refined over decades of polite racism. "People like you" and "inappropriate passengers" and "charity tickets" were phrases designed to communicate racial animus while maintaining plausible deniability. She had learned to weaponize concern to dress up discrimination as customer service, to make exclusion sound like quality control. But Victoria had never encountered someone like Zara Williams. She had never attacked someone who possessed real power, someone who could respond to discrimination, not with anger or retreat, but with consequences that would reshape Victoria's entire life. The pharmaceutical fortune that funded Victoria's lifestyle was about to become worthless compared to the airline fortune that she was currently insulting. The social connections that had protected her from previous incidents were about to become liabilities when her behavior was broadcast to millions of people. The privilege that had insulated her from accountability was about to collide with power that she couldn't recognize or understand. Victoria Whitmore-Bancroft was accustomed to winning these confrontations through sheer persistence and social intimidation. She had no idea that she was about to lose everything to a 26-year-old woman in a Stanford hoodie who owned the aircraft they were sitting in. Altitude Airlines had been founded on principles that were revolutionary in an industry known for treating passengers as cargo and employees as expendable resources. Marcus Williams had built the company from a single leased Boeing 737 into a global carrier worth $3.2 billion. But he had never forgotten the values that had driven him to start the airline in the first place. The company's founding philosophy was elegantly simple: treat every person with dignity, whether they were paying for economy or first class, whether they were employees or passengers, whether they were profitable or problematic. This wasn't just corporate messaging. It was embedded in every aspect of the company's operations, from hiring practices to customer service protocols. Employee training at Altitude Airlines included mandatory modules on unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and conflict de-escalation. Flight attendants were taught to recognize signs of discrimination and were empowered to intervene when passengers created hostile environments for other travelers. Gate agents were trained to question their own assumptions about who belonged in which cabin class. The company's technology infrastructure included real-time incident reporting that allowed employees to document discrimination immediately. Every interaction between staff and passengers was logged, creating a database that company executives used to identify patterns and implement targeted training. When problems were identified, solutions were implemented quickly and decisively. Marcus Williams had personally reviewed every discrimination complaint, no matter how minor. He had fired employees who demonstrated persistent bias, but he had also created rehabilitation programs for staff who were willing to learn and grow. The company's approach to bias wasn't punitive. It was educational, based on the belief that most discrimination came from ignorance rather than malice. The airline's commitment to dignity extended beyond passenger interactions to employee relations. Altitude Airlines paid above industry wages, offered comprehensive health care, and provided educational opportunities for staff who wanted to advance their careers. The company's employee retention rate was the highest in the aviation industry, creating a stable workforce that understood and embraced the company's values. Customer feedback surveys consistently ranked Altitude Airlines highest in passenger satisfaction, particularly in categories related to respect and dignity. The company had won numerous awards for corporate social responsibility, and its stock had outperformed industry averages for 12 consecutive years. But Marcus Williams had also recognized that maintaining company culture as the business grew was an ongoing challenge. In his final months, he had been developing enhanced protocols for preventing and addressing discrimination, including expanded training programs, stronger accountability measures, and technology solutions for real-time bias detection. The reforms that Zara was planning to implement would take her father's vision even further. She had spent the week since becoming CEO developing a comprehensive anti-discrimination protocol that would become the gold standard for the aviation industry. Her proposal included AI-powered monitoring of passenger interactions, mandatory bias training for all customer-facing employees, and immediate consequences for discriminatory behavior. Flight 847 was about to become the testing ground for whether Altitude Airlines' values were strong enough to survive the most public discrimination incident in the company's history. The confrontation unfolding in the first-class cabin would determine not just Zara's future as CEO, but the airline's reputation as an industry leader in human dignity. The system Marcus Williams had built was about to face its ultimate test. The first-class cabin had become a pressure cooker with every seat occupied by passengers who were no longer pretending to ignore the confrontation unfolding between Victoria and Zara. The ambient jazz that had been playing through the aircraft's sound system seemed absurdly peaceful compared to the electric tension crackling through the air. Sandra Mills stood between the two women, her 15 years of experience with difficult passengers, telling her that this situation was spiraling beyond normal conflict resolution protocols. She could feel the weight of every phone camera pointed in her direction, the awareness that whatever happened next would likely be viewed by thousands of people within hours. Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft, Sandra said, her voice carrying the diplomatic tone she had perfected through years of dealing with entitled passengers. I understand your concern about seating assignments, but I can assure you that Ms. Williams's ticket is valid, and her seat assignment is correct. Victoria's face had moved beyond red into a shade approaching purple. The stress of the federal investigation, combined with the Christmas travel chaos and her inability to comprehend how a young black woman could afford first class, had pushed her past the point of rational behavior. Valid according to whom, Victoria snapped. I want to speak to someone in authority. I want to speak to the captain. I want someone to explain to me how this airline's reservation system works, because something is clearly wrong here. The irony of Victoria demanding to speak to authority while harassing the ultimate authority on the aircraft was lost on everyone except Zara, who continued to sit quietly in seat 1A, her father's journal still open in her lap. She was watching the confrontation with the detached interest of someone who understood that she was witnessing a masterclass in privilege colliding with reality. Miguel Santos had switched from his personal phone to his professional video equipment, a high-definition camera that he used for creating content about workplace discrimination in tech. His live stream audience had grown to over 8,000 viewers, and the engagement was unlike anything he had ever seen. "This is absolutely wild," Miguel whispered to his camera. "We are watching someone demand to speak to authority while literally harassing the person who owns the company. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife." Rachel Martinez's TikTok had exploded beyond her usual audience. Her follower count was climbing in real time as the video was shared across every social media platform. The hashtags were beginning to trend, and her comment section was moving too fast for her to read. David Cohen, the divorce attorney, had abandoned any pretense of working, and was documenting the incident with the precision of someone who understood that he was witnessing something that would likely end up in court. His legal training told him that Victoria was creating multiple liability issues for herself with every word she spoke. "She's committing harassment in front of dozens of witnesses," David said quietly to the passenger next to him. "Everything she's saying is being recorded by multiple people. If this goes to trial, the evidence will be overwhelming." Sarah Thompson, the retired teacher, had moved from her seat to stand in the aisle, positioning herself between Victoria and Zara in a protective stance that came from 3 decades of shielding students from bullies. Her presence seemed to give other passengers courage to speak up. Young Lady Sarah said, addressing Zara directly, "You don't need to justify your presence here to anyone. You have every right to be in that seat." Victoria turned her fury toward Sarah. "This is a private conversation that doesn't concern you." "Nothing about this has been private," Sarah replied, gesturing toward the phones recording the interaction. "You've made your accusations public, so the response is public too. And what I'm seeing is a young woman being harassed for the crime of existing while black in first class. The phrase 'existing while black' hit the cabin like a lightning strike." Several passengers gasped audibly. Victoria's face went white as she realized that her coded language wasn't as subtle as she thought. "That's not... I never said anything about you're twisting my words," Victoria stammered. "I'm repeating your words," Sarah replied calmly. "You've questioned this young woman's right to be here, demanded to see her boarding pass, suggested she didn't pay for her ticket, and used language that makes your assumptions crystal clear." Captain Elena Vasquez had been monitoring the situation from the cockpit through the aircraft's internal communication system. As a Latina woman who had faced her own share of discrimination during her rise through the ranks of aviation, she recognized the patterns immediately. She also knew that the situation was escalating beyond what the flight crew could handle alone. Elena made the decision to intervene directly. The cockpit door opened and Captain Vasquez emerged into the first-class cabin wearing her uniform with its 4 gold stripes that commanded immediate respect. Her presence shifted the entire atmosphere of the confrontation, bringing military precision to what had been civilian chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elena announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who was responsible for everyone's safety at 35,000 feet. "I'm Captain Vasquez. I've been monitoring this situation and I need to address it before we can continue our departure procedures." Victoria immediately turned toward the captain, relief flooding her face. "Captain, thank you. I've been trying to resolve a seating error with your crew, but no one seems willing to address my legitimate concerns about Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft." Elena interrupted, consulting the passenger manifest on her tablet. "Your concerns have been noted. However, I need to inform you that continuing to harass other passengers is a violation of federal aviation regulations. Specifically, you're creating a disturbance that interferes with crew duties and creates a hostile environment for other travelers." Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "I'm not harassing anyone. I'm asking legitimate questions about how your reservation system—" "Ma'am," Elena said, her voice cutting through Victoria's protestations like a blade. "You've questioned another passenger's right to be on this aircraft, demanded to see her personal documents, made accusations about ticket fraud, and used language that suggests your objections are based on the passenger's race rather than any actual policy violation." The captain's words hung in the air like an indictment. Every passenger in the first-class cabin was recording, and Elena's professional assessment of Victoria's behavior was being broadcast live to thousands of viewers. Miguel's audience had grown to over 15,000 people. His camera captured the moment when Victoria realized that her behavior was being officially documented by the aircraft's captain. "This is unprecedented," Miguel whispered to his live stream. "The captain just called out racial profiling by name. She's not using coded language or diplomatic terms. She's calling it what it is." Elena turned to address the entire cabin. "At Altitude Airlines, we have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination in any form. Every passenger on this aircraft has the right to travel with dignity regardless of their appearance, age, race, or any other characteristic. Harassment of fellow passengers is not tolerated." Victoria's world was beginning to crumble around her. The captain's words were being recorded by multiple passengers, and she could see her carefully constructed social media feeds filling with notifications. Her phone was buzzing incessantly with texts from friends who had already seen the videos. But instead of retreating, Victoria doubled down. "I want to file a complaint," Victoria declared. "This airline has clearly failed to maintain the standards that first-class passengers expect. I want corporate contact information, and I want assurance that this situation will be reviewed by someone with actual authority." The cabin fell silent, except for the hum of the aircraft's systems. Zara finally looked up from her father's journal, making direct eye contact with Victoria for the first time since the confrontation began. When Zara spoke, her voice was quiet, but carried a weight that seemed to still the entire aircraft. "Ma'am, Zara said you want to speak to someone with actual authority." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Yes, I want to speak to someone who can address this situation appropriately." Zara reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out her phone. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for, then placed a call on speaker so the entire cabin could hear. The phone rang twice before it was answered. Captain Vasquez speaking. Elena looked confused, then checked her own phone as it began to ring. She answered, still standing in the aisle. Captain Zara said, her voice still quiet, but now carrying unmistakable authority. "This is Zara Williams. We need to talk." The moment when Captain Elena Vasquez realized that the young woman in the hoodie was addressing her directly through the phone created a silence so profound that it seemed to suck the oxygen out of the first-class cabin. Elena looked at her phone, then at Zara, then back at her phone, her military training warring with the impossibility of what was happening. "Miss Williams," Elena said carefully, her voice carrying a new note of respect that made every passenger lean forward. "I didn't realize you were on board." Victoria's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comedic if the situation weren't so serious. Confusion, irritation dawning awareness, and then a growing horror as she began to understand that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic she thought she controlled. "Who is Ms. Williams?" Victoria demanded, her voice rising to a pitch that made several passengers wince. "And why is the captain taking phone calls from passengers during boarding?" Zara ended the call and stood up from seat 1A. When she moved, there was something in her posture that commanded attention in a way that volume never could. She was still wearing the same hoodie and jeans, still carrying the same worn backpack, but something about her presence had changed. It was as if she had been holding back some essential part of herself, and now she was allowing it to emerge. "Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft." Zara said, her voice still quiet, but now carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "You asked to speak to someone with authority. You wanted to know who could address this situation appropriately." Victoria's eyes darted between Zara and Captain Vasquez, trying to understand the connection between a young black woman in casual clothes and the obvious deference being shown by the aircraft's captain. "My name is Zara Williams." Zara continued, her words falling into the silent cabin like stones into still water. "I am the majority shareholder and CEO of Altitude Airlines. This is my aircraft. These are my employees. And you have spent the last 20 minutes harassing me on my own plane." The words hit the cabin like a physical force. Multiple passengers gasped audibly. Phones that had been recording the confrontation now captured the exact moment when reality shifted and the hunter became the hunted. Miguel's livestream audience exploded past 20,000 viewers as he captured Victoria's face in the moment of recognition. "Oh my God," he whispered to his camera. "Oh my God, she's the CEO. This woman has been harassing the CEO of the airline. This is the most beautiful karma I have ever witnessed." Rachel Martinez's TikTok was being shared across every social media platform faster than she could track. Her comment section was moving at light speed. Plot twist of the century. Karen about to get educated, she owns the whole airline. This is why you treat people right. Victoria stood frozen in the aisle, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to process information that didn't fit her worldview. The young black woman she had been harassing wasn't just a passenger who had somehow gotten an upgraded seat. She was the owner of the entire airline. "That's impossible," Victoria whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. She was remembering the way the gate agent had addressed Zara, the way the flight attendant had shown her deference, the way the captain was treating her with obvious respect, Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft. "Captain Vasquez," said her voice now carrying the formal tone she used for official pronouncements, "you've been speaking to Zara Williams, daughter of Marcus Williams, the founder of Altitude Airlines. Ms. Williams inherited controlling interest in the company following her father's recent death, and she assumed the role of CEO last week." The information hit Victoria like a series of physical blows. Every assumption she had made, every prejudice she had expressed, every degrading comment she had directed at Zara was now revealed to be not just morally wrong, but spectacularly stupid from a purely practical standpoint. David Cohen, the divorce attorney, was frantically taking notes on his phone while trying to contain his professional amazement. "This is the most dramatic reversal of fortune I've seen in 30 years of practice," he murmured to the passenger next to him. "She just committed career suicide on live television." Sarah Thompson, the retired teacher, was shaking her head with the satisfaction of someone who had spent decades watching bullies get their comeuppance. "Honey," she said to Zara, "I am so sorry you had to endure that behavior, and I am so proud of how you handled yourself." Victoria's phone was buzzing incessantly as social media notifications flooded her devices. Her social media feeds were filling with tags and shares as the videos went viral. She could see her reputation crumbling in real time as friends and acquaintances shared the footage with increasingly horrified commentary. "I didn't know," Victoria said, her voice now small and desperate. "I couldn't have known. She's dressed like—" Victoria's voice trailed off as she realized that completing that sentence would only make everything worse. Dressed like what, Zara asked, her voice still quiet, but now carrying unmistakable authority. "Please finish that thought." "I'm interested in your assessment of how the CEO of an airline should dress." Victoria's face had gone completely pale. She could see the phones recording her, could feel the weight of thousands of eyes watching her through social media, could sense her carefully constructed life beginning to collapse around her. I thought the seating assignment seemed—" Victoria stammered, trying to find words that could somehow undo the previous 20 minutes of recorded harassment. "You thought what exactly?" Zara pressed. "You thought that a young black woman couldn't afford first class. You thought that someone in a hoodie didn't belong in seat 1A. You thought that your assumptions about who deserves dignity were more important than basic human respect." Each question hit Victoria like a hammer blow. She was trapped in the aisle of an aircraft surrounded by witnesses facing someone who possessed the power to destroy her life with a single phone call. Miguel's camera captured every micro-expression on Victoria's face as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. "Ladies and gentlemen," he whispered to his audience, "we are witnessing the exact moment when privilege meets consequences. This is what accountability looks like when it happens in real time." Zara reached into her backpack and pulled out a leather portfolio that contained documents bearing the Altitude Airlines logo. She opened it to reveal paperwork that confirmed her identity and position, though everyone in the cabin already believed her. "These are my corporate credentials," Zara said, holding the documents so that Victoria could see them clearly. "My employee ID, my security clearance, my authorization codes. Everything you demanded to see, and more than you have any right to examine." Victoria looked at the documents with the expression of someone watching their execution warrant being signed. Everything was official. Everything was legitimate, and everything confirmed that she had just committed social and professional suicide on live television. "Ms. Williams," Sandra Mills said, stepping forward with obvious relief. "Is there anything I can do to make the remainder of your flight more comfortable?" "Actually, yes," Zara replied, her voice taking on a businesslike tone that made everyone in the cabin pay attention. "I think it's time to review our passenger conduct policies with Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft." Victoria's knees almost buckled. She could see her entire future crumbling: the social connections, the exclusive memberships, the carefully maintained reputation that defined her entire identity. All of it was collapsing because she had targeted the wrong person on the wrong day. "Please," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean any harm. I was just confused about the seating. I would never intentionally—" "Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft." Zara interrupted, her voice still quiet, but now carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You have created a hostile environment for other passengers, violated federal aviation regulations regarding passenger conduct, and engaged in behavior that directly contradicts everything this airline stands for." The cabin was so quiet that the aircraft's ventilation system sounded like a hurricane. Every passenger was recording, every word was being documented, and Victoria was finally understanding that her actions had consequences that she couldn't buy or manipulate her way out of. Captain Vasquez stepped forward, her military bearing making it clear that the situation had moved beyond passenger service into the realm of federal aviation law. "Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft Elena said, based on your behavior during boarding, I'm declaring you a disruptive passenger under Federal Aviation Regulation 91.111. You are being removed from this flight." The words "being removed from this flight" hung in the air like a death sentence. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions that captured 30 years of entitlement being destroyed in real time. The color drained from her surgically enhanced features as she realized that her privileged life was about to collide with consequences that no amount of money could avoid. "You can't remove me from this flight," Victoria said, her voice rising to a near hysteric pitch. "I paid $7,000 for this ticket. I have rights. I have connections. My husband will sue this airline into bankruptcy." Zara remained standing in the aisle, her father's journal still in her hands, watching Victoria's meltdown with the detached interest of someone who was witnessing the collapse of everything she had been fighting against her entire career. Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft, Zara said quietly, "Your husband's connections won't help you here. Your threats won't help you here. Your money won't help you here. What might help you here is taking responsibility for your behavior and apologizing to everyone you've harassed." The suggestion of an apology seemed to break something inside Victoria. Instead of contrition, she erupted into rage that revealed the true depths of her prejudice. "Apologize?" Victoria shrieked. "Apologize for what? For expecting first-class service when I pay first-class prices? For questioning why someone dressed like a vagrant is sitting in the most expensive seat on the plane? For having standards?" The word vagrant echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. Every passenger recoiled at the naked racism of the statement. Phones captured the moment when Victoria's mask finally slipped, completely revealing the ugly truth that had been barely concealed beneath her coded language. Miguel's live stream audience had exploded past 50,000 viewers. His camera shook slightly as he tried to process what he was witnessing. "She really just called the CEO of the airline a vagrant," he whispered to his audience, on camera, while being recorded by dozens of people. This is beyond stupidity. This is self-destruction on a level I've never seen. Rachel Martinez's TikTok was being shared faster than she could track. The hashtags were trending globally. Her comment section was a mixture of outrage and amazement. Did she really just say that Karen has lost her mind? This is going to ruin her life. Consequences incoming. Captain Vasquez stepped forward, her military bearing making it clear that the situation had moved beyond passenger relations into the realm of federal law enforcement. Ma'am Elena said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who was responsible for everyone's safety, "Your behavior has escalated beyond what we can tolerate on this aircraft. You are creating a disturbance that affects the safety and comfort of all passengers." Victoria turned her fury toward the captain. "I am a premium passenger on this airline. I expect premium treatment. I expect to be seated next to people who belong in first class, not charity cases, who somehow scammed their way into seats they can't afford." The phrase "charity cases" was the final straw for several passengers who had been containing their outrage. David Cohen stood up from his seat, his legal training telling him that he was witnessing behavior that would be studied in law schools for decades. Ma'am David said, his voice carrying 30 years of courtroom authority, "You are committing harassment, discrimination, and creating a hostile environment based on racial prejudice. Everything you've said has been recorded by multiple witnesses. You are creating massive legal liability for yourself with every word." Victoria turned toward David with contempt. "And who are you to threaten me?" Another passenger who doesn't understand how premium travel is supposed to work. "I'm a federal prosecutor." David lied smoothly, deciding that the situation called for maximum impact. "And I'm watching you commit federal crimes in real time while being recorded by dozens of witnesses." The mention of federal prosecution finally penetrated Victoria's rage. She looked around the cabin with dawning awareness, seeing for the first time the forest of phones pointed at her, the expressions of disgust on every face, the social media notifications flooding her own device. "You people don't understand," Victoria said, her voice becoming desperate. "I'm Victoria Whitmore-Bancroft. My husband owns pharmaceutical companies. I sit on charity boards. I have connections throughout this industry. You can't treat me like this." Zara finally spoke, her voice cutting through Victoria's desperation like a blade. "Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft." Zara said, "Your husband's pharmaceutical companies are currently under federal investigation for price manipulation. Your charity boards are investigating your conduct after previous incidents were brought to their attention. Your connections in this industry are meaningless because you just harassed the person who employs 45,000 people across 6 continents." The information hit Victoria like a physical blow. Zara had clearly done research on the Bancroft family, had understood exactly who she was dealing with, and had been allowing Victoria to dig her own grave while documenting every shovel of dirt. "How do you know about the federal investigation?" Victoria whispered. "Because I serve on the Business Ethics Council that's cooperating with the Department of Justice," Zara replied. "Because your husband's companies have been on our industry watch list for 2 years. Because when someone harasses me on my own aircraft, I like to understand exactly who I'm dealing with." Victoria's world was collapsing in real time. Not only had she attacked the CEO of a major airline, but she had attacked someone who was connected to the very investigation that threatened her family's fortune. Sarah Thompson, the retired teacher, had heard enough. She stood up and addressed Victoria directly with the voice she had used to discipline students for 3 decades. "Young woman," Sarah said, her teacher authority cutting through all the chaos, "you have behaved like a spoiled child who was never taught basic human decency. You have embarrassed yourself, your family, and everyone who has the misfortune to be associated with you." The phrase "young woman," directed at 48-year-old Victoria in front of dozens of witnesses, was the perfect punctuation to the evening's humiliation. Victoria looked around the cabin at faces filled with disgust at phones recording her breakdown at social media notifications that were destroying her reputation in real time. "I want off this plane," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want off this plane right now." Captain Vasquez nodded grimly. "Ma'am, that's exactly what's going to happen. Airport police are being called to escort you off the aircraft." As if on cue, the aircraft's door opened and 2 uniformed officers from the Massachusetts State Police boarded the plane. Their presence transformed the cabin from a place of social conflict into a crime scene. "Good evening," Officer Maria Rodriguez said, consulting her notes. "We're looking for Victoria Whitmore-Bancroft. We've received reports of passenger disruption and harassment." Victoria looked at the officers with the expression of someone watching their execution warrant being delivered. Everything she had built her life around status connections, the belief that money could insulate her from consequences, was crumbling around her. The breaking point had been reached, and Victoria Whitmore-Bancroft was about to discover that some actions have consequences that no amount of privilege can avoid. The Massachusetts State Police officers who boarded Flight 847 brought with them an authority that transformed the cabin's atmosphere from social drama to legal proceeding. Officer Maria Rodriguez, a 15-year veteran who had dealt with every form of airport disruption imaginable, surveyed the scene with professional efficiency. "Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft," Officer Rodriguez said, consulting her notes, "we've received reports of passenger harassment, disruption of airline operations, and creation of a hostile environment based on discriminatory behavior. We need you to come with us." Victoria looked at the officers with the expression of someone who had never imagined that consequences could find her in first class. Her entire worldview was built on the assumption that wealth provided immunity from the kind of treatment reserved for common criminals. "Officers," Victoria said, attempting to summon the imperious tone that had served her throughout her privileged life. "There's been some kind of misunderstanding. I'm Victoria Whitmore-Bancroft. My husband owns Bancroft Pharmaceuticals. I was simply addressing a seating issue with airline personnel." Officer Rodriguez had heard variations of this speech hundreds of times. Wealthy passengers who believed their money made them immune to federal aviation law were a regular feature of her work at Logan International Airport. "Ma'am," Rodriguez replied, "federal aviation regulations apply to all passengers regardless of their economic status. Creating a disturbance, harassing other passengers, and interfering with crew duties are serious violations that carry both civil and criminal penalties." The cabin had become an amphitheater where every passenger was documenting the collapse of Victoria's entitled worldview. Miguel's live stream had passed 75,000 viewers, making it one of the most watched aviation incidents in social media history. Rachel's TikTok was being shared across every platform with hashtags trending globally. Zara remained standing beside seat 1A, her father's journal in her hands, watching the confrontation with the calm detachment of someone who understood that justice sometimes took dramatic forms. She had experienced discrimination countless times in her life, but never had she been in a position to ensure that the perpetrator faced immediate consequences. Captain Elena Vasquez stepped forward to address the officers directly. "Officers, I need to provide you with context for this situation. The passenger who was harassed is Zara Williams, the CEO and majority owner of Altitude Airlines." Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft spent approximately 30 minutes questioning Ms. Williams' right to be on the aircraft, demanding to see her credentials, and using language that clearly indicated racial bias. The information that the victim was the airline's CEO created visible shifts in the officer's demeanor. This wasn't just passenger-on-passenger harassment. This was a customer attacking the head of a major corporation while being recorded by dozens of witnesses. Ms. Williams' Officer Rodriguez said, turning to address Zara directly, "Can you confirm Captain Vasquez's account of events?" Zara nodded calmly. "Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft approached me shortly after boarding and questioned my right to sit in first class. When I explained that I had a valid ticket, she escalated to demands that I prove my ability to afford the seat. She used language that made clear her assumptions were based on my race and appearance. "And you are indeed the CEO of this airline?" Rodriguez asked, though the deference being shown by all airline personnel made the answer obvious. "I am," Zara replied. "I inherited the company following my father's recent death. Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft has spent the last half hour harassing me on my own aircraft while demanding to speak to someone in authority." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone in the cabin. Victoria had demanded authority and had been attacking authority the entire time. She had insisted on speaking to someone who could address her concerns, and that person had been sitting quietly in seat 1A while enduring increasingly personal attacks. Victoria's face had gone through several color changes as she processed the full magnitude of her mistake. Not only had she committed harassment in front of dozens of witnesses, but she had targeted the one person on the aircraft who had the power to ensure that the consequences would be swift and severe. "I want to press charges," Zara said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had made a difficult decision. Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft created a hostile environment, violated federal aviation law, and engaged in behavior that directly contradicts everything this company stands for. Officer Rodriguez nodded and began reading Victoria her rights, while several passengers continued recording the arrest. The Miranda warning delivered in the first-class cabin of a commercial aircraft created a surreal soundtrack to what was already the most dramatic reversal of fortune any of the witnesses had ever seen. "You have the right to remain silent," Rodriguez began. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Victoria's legs nearly buckled as the reality of criminal charges finally penetrated her shock. "Wait," she whispered. "This is all a misunderstanding. I never meant to harass anyone. I was just confused about seating assignments." "Ma'am," Rodriguez replied, continuing the rights advisement, "dozens of witnesses have recorded your statements over the past 30 minutes. The evidence against you is extensive and clear." Miguel's camera captured the exact moment when Victoria realized that her recorded statements couldn't be denied or reinterpreted. Every threat, every assumption, every degrading comment had been preserved by multiple witnesses with high-definition video equipment. David Cohen, the divorce attorney, was shaking his head with professional amazement. "In 30 years of practice," he said to the passenger next to him, "I've never seen someone create such comprehensive evidence against themselves. It's like watching someone build their own prison cell while the guards take notes." Sarah Thompson, the retired teacher, watched the proceedings with the satisfaction of someone who had spent decades hoping that bullies would finally face consequences for their behavior. "Honey," she said to Zara, "your father would be so proud of how you handled this. You showed more grace under pressure than most people show in their entire lives." As Officer Rodriguez finished reading Victoria her rights, her partner began documenting the incident for their report. The extensive video evidence being provided by passengers would create one of the most thoroughly documented cases of aviation harassment in federal court history. Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft Rodriguez said, "You need to gather your personal belongings. You're being removed from this aircraft and taken into custody for processing." Victoria looked around the cabin with desperate eyes searching for someone who might intervene on her behalf. But every face reflected disgust, anger, or simple fascination with watching justice unfold in real time. "Please," Victoria said, turning to Zara with tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. If I had known who you were, if you had known who I was, you would have treated me differently." Zara interrupted, her voice still quiet but now carrying unmistakable steel. "But you should treat everyone with basic dignity regardless of who they are or what you think they can afford." The moral clarity of Zara's response cut through all of Victoria's attempts at manipulation. This wasn't about mistaken identity or misunderstood intentions. This was about fundamental human decency, and Victoria had failed the test spectacularly. As the officers escorted Victoria toward the aircraft door, she made one final attempt to assert the privilege that had defined her entire adult life. "My husband will have your jobs," she called back to the airline personnel. Bancroft Pharmaceuticals has contracts worth millions of dollars with airlines. "You'll regret this." Captain Vasquez smiled grimly. "Ma'am, given that your husband's companies are under federal investigation for criminal conspiracy, I don't think his threats carry much weight. And since you just threatened the CEO of our airline, I suspect those contracts you mentioned are about to be canceled." The threat of contract cancellation finally silenced Victoria completely. She had played her last card and discovered that it was worthless against someone who owned the entire deck. The conference call that took place at 35,000 feet between Zara Williams and the Altitude Airlines Board of Directors would later be studied in business schools as a masterclass in crisis leadership and rapid organizational transformation. Using the aircraft's satellite communication system, Zara connected with 11 board members who were scattered across 4 time zones, all of whom had been monitoring the viral incident in real time. "Ladies and gentlemen," Zara began, her voice carrying through the aircraft's speakers as passengers listened with rapt attention. "Tonight's incident has created both a crisis and an opportunity. We have the chance to transform a moment of discrimination into industry-wide reform that honors my father's vision for dignified air travel." Board Chairman Robert Harrison, participating from his home in Chicago, had spent the last hour reviewing the viral footage and coordinating with the company's legal and public relations teams. "Zara," he said, "the board unanimously supports your handling of this situation. Your grace under pressure and measured response have generated unprecedented positive publicity for the company." But Zara wasn't interested in capitalizing on positive publicity. She was focused on ensuring that no passenger would ever again experience the harassment she had endured, and she had spent the flight developing a comprehensive reform package that would revolutionize how airlines addressed discrimination. "I'm proposing immediate implementation of the Dignity First protocol," Zara announced, reading from notes she had taken in her father's journal. "This will include real-time bias monitoring, enhanced staff training, and immediate consequences for discriminatory behavior by passengers or employees." The protocol Zara outlined was ambitious in scope and unprecedented in the aviation industry. Every customer interaction would be monitored by AI designed to detect patterns of discriminatory language or behavior. Flight attendants would be empowered to remove abusive passengers immediately without requiring approval from ground supervisors. All airline personnel would undergo monthly bias training with career advancement tied to demonstrated commitment to inclusive service. Dr. Patricia Williams, the board member who oversaw human resources, had been taking detailed notes during Zara's presentation. "The technology infrastructure for real-time monitoring will require significant investment," she said. "We're looking at approximately $50 million in development costs over the next 18 months. "Then we'll spend $50 million? Zara replied without hesitation. "Because the alternative is allowing incidents like tonight's to continue happening to our passengers. That's not acceptable under any circumstances." Miguel Santos, who had been live-streaming the board discussion to his audience of over 300,000 viewers, provided real-time commentary on the corporate response. "Ladies and gentlemen," he whispered to his camera, "we are watching a 26-year-old CEO commit her company to spending $50 million to prevent discrimination. This is leadership in action." The board vote to approve Zara's Dignity First protocol was unanimous, but implementation would require coordination across every aspect of the company's operations. Chief Technology Officer Sandra Mitchell would oversee development of the bias detection algorithms. Head of Training, Michael Rodriguez, would redesign all customer service curricula. Legal Director Jennifer Park would coordinate with federal regulators to establish industry standards. "This protocol will become the template for the entire aviation industry," Zara declared. "We're going to share our technology with competitors, not to diminish our advantage, but to ensure that dignity becomes the standard rather than the exception in air travel." The decision to share proprietary anti-discrimination technology with competitors was unprecedented in corporate America, where competitive advantages were typically guarded like state secrets. But Zara understood that her father's vision couldn't be realized by one company alone. It required transformation of an entire industry. Captain Elena Vasquez, who had been monitoring the board discussion from the cockpit, understood the operational implications of the new protocols. "Ms. Williams," she said over the intercom, "the flight crew union will need to be briefed on enhanced authority to remove disruptive passengers. We'll also need updated training on legal protocols for documenting discrimination incidents." Rachel Martinez's TikTok audience was exploding with comments as she broadcast the board discussion live. Her followers were witnessing corporate decision-making in real time, watching a major airline commit to revolutionary changes based on a single incident of passenger harassment. "Y'all," Rachel whispered to her phone, "this is insane. We are literally watching this company transform itself because one Karen thought she could harass someone with impunity. This is what accountability looks like when it happens fast." The implementation timeline Zara outlined was aggressive by any corporate standard. Bias detection technology would be piloted within 30 days. Enhanced training programs would launch within 60 days. Full deployment across all Altitude Airlines operations would be complete within 6 months. Board member Thomas Rodriguez, who oversaw financial operations, raised concerns about the rapid implementation schedule. "Zara, these timelines are extremely ambitious. Industry-wide transformation typically takes years, not months." "Mr. Rodriguez," Zara replied, "my father spent 32 years building this company on principles of dignity and respect. Tonight's incident proves that we can't afford to wait years for change. Every day we delay implementation is another day that passengers like me face harassment without adequate protection." The personal nature of Zara's commitment to reform resonated throughout the cabin as passengers listened to her outline specific changes that would prevent similar incidents. David Cohen was taking detailed notes for potential coordination with civil rights organizations that had been advocating for stronger anti-discrimination measures in transportation. "Ms. Williams, David said the NAACP and other civil rights groups have been pushing for exactly these kinds of reforms for decades. Your company's willingness to lead on this issue will generate support across advocacy communities." Dr. Margaret Foster, the board member responsible for corporate partnerships, understood the broader industry implications of Zara's announcement. "If we're sharing our anti-discrimination technology with competitors, we need to coordinate with airline industry associations to ensure uniform implementation standards." Dr. Foster Zara replied, "I'll be calling emergency meetings with the International Air Transport Association and the Airlines for America Trade Group. This can't be optional technology that some carriers adopt and others ignore. It has to become industry standard." The scope of transformation Zara was proposing extended beyond technology and training to fundamental changes in corporate culture. Employee performance reviews would include bias incident records. Customer service ratings would prioritize dignity metrics over efficiency measures. Executive compensation would be tied to inclusive service indicators. Sarah Thompson, the retired teacher, had spent 3 decades implementing educational reforms, and she recognized the ambition of what Zara was attempting. "Honey," she said, "changing corporate culture is like changing school culture. It requires commitment from leadership, buy-in from staff, and constant reinforcement of new values." "Mrs. Thompson," Zara replied, "that's exactly why we're moving quickly. The longer we take to implement these changes, the more entrenched existing patterns become. We have momentum from tonight's incident, and we need to use it while the entire industry is paying attention." The board discussion concluded with specific assignments for each member and aggressive timelines for reporting progress. Zara had transformed a moment of personal attack into a comprehensive reform agenda that would reshape how airlines addressed discrimination. As Flight 847 began its descent toward Denver, passengers were witnessing more than the resolution of a single incident. They were documenting the birth of a new standard for corporate leadership and social responsibility in the aviation industry. The Suffolk County Detention Center in Boston processed Victoria Whitmore-Bancroft with the mechanical efficiency of a system designed to handle hundreds of arrestees every day. The booking officer, Detective James Murphy, had seen every form of wealthy entitlement during his 15 years in law enforcement, but Victoria's case stood out for its spectacular self-destruction. "Ma'am," Detective Murphy said as he photographed Victoria for her booking record, "I need to inform you that your arrest has generated significant media attention. Multiple news outlets are already reporting on the incident, and the video evidence has been viewed by millions of people." Victoria stared at the camera with hollow eyes, the reality of her situation finally penetrating the shock that had protected her during the arrest. The booking photo would capture her at the exact moment when privilege met consequences. Her surgically enhanced features twisted by the realization that money couldn't undo what she had done. "I need to call my husband, Victoria," whispered her voice barely audible in the sterile booking room. "You'll have access to a phone after processing," Murphy replied. "But ma'am, based on the evidence I've reviewed, you're looking at federal charges for interference with flight crew operations, intimidation of passengers based on protected characteristics, and creating a disturbance on an aircraft. These are serious felonies with mandatory minimum sentences." The words mandatory minimum hit Victoria like a physical blow. She had spent her entire adult life believing that wealth provided immunity from the kind of consequences faced by ordinary criminals. The idea that she could face actual prison time for behavior that she considered normal was incomprehensible. Meanwhile, on Flight 847, the atmosphere had transformed from tense confrontation to celebratory vindication. Passengers who had witnessed Victoria's arrest were sharing their footage with increasingly supportive commentary about Zara's grace under pressure and increasingly harsh condemnation of Victoria's behavior. David Cohen, the civil rights attorney, had connected with other passengers to coordinate their witness testimonies. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the cabin, "what we witnessed tonight was textbook racial profiling and harassment. The video evidence is overwhelming, and Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft's statements created clear federal liability." Miguel Santos was coordinating with his live stream audience to compile the most damaging clips from Victoria's meltdown. His followers had created a comprehensive timeline of her statements from the initial assumptions about Zara's right to be in first class to the final racist epithet that sealed her legal doom. Chat Miguel said to his camera, "We are watching justice happen in real time. This woman thought she could harass a young black woman with impunity, not knowing that she was attacking someone with the power to ensure consequences. The karma is absolutely beautiful." Rachel Martinez's TikTok had been picked up by major news networks, and she was fielding interview requests from reporters who wanted first-hand accounts of Victoria's behavior. Her video had become the primary documentation of the incident, and her commentary was being quoted by civil rights advocates as evidence of generational change in how discrimination is challenged. Captain Elena Vasquez was coordinating with air traffic control to ensure their delayed departure didn't create cascading delays for other flights, but she was also monitoring the social media response to gauge whether additional security measures would be needed upon landing in Denver. Denver approach. Elena radioed Altitude 847 requesting priority handling due to media attention surrounding passenger incident. "We may need law enforcement presence at the gate upon arrival." The control tower had already been briefed about the viral incident, and news vans were assembling at Denver International Airport to document Zara's arrival. The story had grown beyond aviation news into a broader conversation about dignity, leadership, and accountability in corporate America. Zara was reviewing text messages from the Altitude Airlines board of directors who were expressing unanimous support for her handling of the incident, while also coordinating crisis management strategies to capitalize on the positive publicity the company was receiving. Board Chairman Robert Harrison had texted Zara, "Your father would be incredibly proud." You turned a moment of personal attack into a demonstration of company values. The entire board stands behind you. Customer service lines at Altitude Airlines were being flooded with calls from passengers who wanted to book flights specifically because of how Zara had handled the discrimination incident. Social media was amplifying stories from travelers who were sharing their own experiences with airline bias, and many were praising Altitude for its leadership response. In Boston, Victoria's husband Richard was watching CNN coverage of his wife's arrest while his legal team developed strategies for damage control. The pharmaceutical investigation had already made the Bancroft name toxic in business circles. This incident would make them pariahs in social settings as well. Sir, his lead attorney said your wife's statements were recorded by dozens of witnesses in high definition. She used explicitly racial language while harassing the CEO of a major airline. There's no defense strategy that can overcome this evidence. Richard stared at footage of his wife being led away in handcuffs while reporters discussed the broader implications of her behavior. Their social connections, country club memberships, and charitable board positions were all about to disappear as wealthy acquaintances distanced themselves from the scandal. "How much is this going to cost us?" Richard asked. "Sir," the attorney replied, "the financial cost will be significant, but the reputational damage will be irreversible. Your wife just became the face of entitled racism in commercial aviation. That's not something money can fix." Back on Flight 847, Sarah Thompson was coordinating with other passengers to ensure their witness statements would be available for both criminal prosecution and civil litigation. Her teacher instincts had activated fully, and she was treating the incident as a learning opportunity for everyone involved. "Young people," Sarah announced to the cabin, "you've witnessed something historic tonight. You've seen what happens when ordinary citizens refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice. Your documentation of this incident will help prevent similar attacks on other travelers." As Flight 847 reached cruising altitude, the immediate consequences of Victoria's behavior were cascading across multiple industries, legal jurisdictions, and social media platforms. The arrest was just the beginning of a reckoning that would reshape how discrimination was addressed in commercial aviation. 6 months after her arrest on Flight 847, Victoria Whitmore-Bancroft sat in a cramped studio apartment in Revere, Massachusetts, surrounded by the debris of her former life. The luxury furnishings, designer clothes, and expensive jewelry that had once defined her identity were gone, sold to pay legal fees, or seized as part of the criminal asset forfeiture process. The federal case against Victoria had concluded with a plea bargain that resulted in 18 months of probation, 500 hours of community service, mandatory bias training, and a criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. The judge had been clear that the extensive video evidence made a trial inadvisable, and Victoria's attorney had counseled acceptance of the prosecution's offer. Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft federal judge Maria Rodriguez had said during sentencing, "Your behavior on that aircraft was not just criminal, it was a betrayal of the basic human dignity that makes civil society possible. Your sentence reflects not just the harm you caused, but the public nature of your actions and their impact on airline safety and passenger welfare." The divorce from Richard had been swift and brutal. The prenuptial agreement's morality clause had stripped Victoria of any claim to the Bancroft pharmaceutical fortune, leaving her with a modest settlement that was quickly consumed by legal fees and living expenses. Richard's attorneys had documented her history of racist incidents to support their argument that her behavior represented a pattern rather than an isolated mistake. Victoria's attempts at social media rehabilitation had backfired spectacularly. Her public apology video, posted 3 months after the incident, had been viewed over 10 million times, primarily by people who found her expressions of remorse insincere and self-serving. The comments section became a repository for additional stories about her previous discriminatory behavior. "I want to apologize to Ms. Williams and to everyone who was hurt by my actions," Victoria had said in the video reading from a script prepared by her crisis management consultant. I realize now that my words and behavior were inappropriate and harmful. I am committed to learning from this experience and becoming a better person." The response had been overwhelmingly negative. Social media users dissected her body language, questioned her sincerity, and shared additional footage from the flight that contradicted her claims of misunderstanding. Hashtags trended for days with users comparing Victoria's video to other failed attempts at damage control by public figures caught engaging in racist behavior. Employment opportunities had proven non-existent for someone whose face had become synonymous with airline discrimination. The few employers willing to consider her application invariably rescinded offers after social media backlash from customers who recognized her name and appearance. Victoria's community service assignment at a food pantry in East Boston had become another source of public scrutiny. Fellow volunteers documented her obvious discomfort with serving clients who were predominantly people of color, sharing videos that showed her struggling to maintain basic politeness during her court-mandated service hours. "She acts like she's afraid the poverty is contagious," whispered Maria Santos, a longtime volunteer who had been assigned to supervise Victoria's community service. "She does the bare minimum required and leaves immediately when her hours are complete." The social isolation Victoria experienced was comprehensive and devastating. Former friends refused to return her calls, fearful that association with her would damage their own reputations. Country club memberships had been revoked. Charitable organizations had removed her from their donor lists. Even her personal physician had suggested she find another practice after other patients complained about sharing waiting room space with her. Victoria's mental health had deteriorated under the constant scrutiny and social rejection. She had developed agoraphobia, avoiding public spaces where she might be recognized. Grocery shopping required careful timing to avoid peak hours, when other customers might document her presence and share it online. The financial pressures were relentless. Her modest divorce settlement was being depleted by the cost of living without the social connections that had previously provided access to discounted services and exclusive opportunities. The apartment in Revere was a far cry from the Beacon Hill mansion where she had entertained pharmaceutical executives and charity board members. Victoria's attempts to maintain her appearance through cosmetic procedures had ended when her dermatologist's office was flooded with negative reviews after her presence was documented by another patient. The video of Victoria leaving the medical spa had been shared thousands of times with commentary about the irony of someone who had attacked another person's appearance seeking cosmetic enhancement. Her court-mandated therapy sessions had become exercises in deflection and denial. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the psychologist assigned to her case, reported minimal progress in Victoria's understanding of how her behavior had affected others. Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft continues to focus on the consequences she has experienced, rather than the harm she caused, Dr. Walsh wrote in her quarterly report to the court. She demonstrates limited empathy for Ms. Williams or understanding of how discriminatory behavior affects its targets. Victoria's story had become a cautionary tale studied by sociologists and criminologists interested in how social media accountability affected individual behavior. Her complete social and economic collapse demonstrated that viral consequences could be more devastating than traditional legal punishment. Flight 847 touched down at Denver International Airport at 11:47 p.m. Mountain Time, nearly 4 hours behind schedule, but carrying passengers who understood they had witnessed something historically significant. The aircraft taxied toward the gate through snow that continued to fall, though the blizzard had weakened to gentle flakes that caught the runway lights like tiny stars. As the aircraft door opened, passengers were greeted by an unprecedented scene. News vans lined the terminal perimeter, their satellite dishes creating a technological forest against the Colorado sky. Airport security had established a media zone where reporters waited with cameras and microphones, all hoping to capture Zara Williams' first public comments as the CEO who had turned discrimination into industry transformation. Captain Elena Vasquez made the final announcement over the aircraft's intercom system. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Denver International Airport. Local time is 11:47 p.m. Thank you for flying with Altitude Airlines, and thank you for demonstrating the values that make air travel a dignified experience for everyone. The applause that erupted from the cabin was spontaneous and sustained. Passengers who had been strangers 8 hours earlier had become allies in documenting one of the most significant civil rights moments in aviation history. They had refused to remain silent when confronted with discrimination, and their courage had enabled justice to unfold in real time. Zara gathered her father's journal and her worn backpack, the same items that had marked her as unworthy in Victoria's prejudiced assessment. As she prepared to disembark, she was surrounded by passengers who wanted to thank her for her grace under pressure and her commitment to transforming airline culture. Miguel Santos had ended his live stream with over 400,000 viewers, making it the most watched aviation incident in social media history. Ladies and gentlemen, he concluded, "We have witnessed something beautiful tonight. We've seen what happens when quiet dignity meets loud prejudice, and dignity wins every time." Rachel Martinez was coordinating with news producers who wanted to interview her about her documentation of the incident. Her TikTok had been viewed over 20 million times, and her commentary was being quoted by civil rights activists as evidence of generational change in how discrimination is challenged. David Cohen was preparing witness statements that would support both criminal prosecution and civil litigation. "Ms. Williams," he said, as they prepared to leave the aircraft, "your father would be incredibly proud of how you honored his values tonight." Sarah Thompson, the retired teacher, had the last word as passengers prepared to deplane. "Young people," she announced, "you've learned something tonight that can't be taught in classrooms. You've learned that refusing to remain silent in the face of injustice is how we create change in the world." As Zara Williams stepped off Flight 847 and into the media glare, she carried with her more than just her personal belongings. She carried the hopes of every traveler who had ever been made to feel unwelcome, the expectations of an industry ready for transformation, and the legacy of a father who had believed that air travel could be a force for human dignity. The flight was over, but the journey toward justice was just beginning. By sunrise on Christmas Day, the footage from Flight 847 had become the most discussed story across every major news platform. CNN led their morning broadcast with a segment titled "Karma at 35,000 feet," while NBC dedicated their entire Christmas morning show to analyzing the broader implications of corporate leadership and airline discrimination. Dr. Michael Harrison, a crisis communications expert at Northwestern University, was providing commentary on multiple networks about the unprecedented nature of the incident. "What we're witnessing," Dr. Harrison told Anderson Cooper during a live CNN interview, "is the complete democratization of accountability through social media." Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft's behavior was documented, distributed, and judged by millions of people within hours of its occurrence. The hashtag #DignityFirst had generated over 2 million posts across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, with users sharing their own experiences of airline discrimination, alongside expressions of support for Zara Williams' leadership. The tag had become a rallying cry for travelers who demanded better treatment from airline personnel and fellow passengers alike. Rachel Martinez's original TikTok video had been viewed over 50 million times across all platforms, making her the most watched civilian journalist of the year. Major news networks were competing to secure exclusive interviews with the college student who had inadvertently documented one of the most significant civil rights moments in aviation history. "I was just traveling home for Christmas," Rachel told Good Morning America during a live interview from Denver. "I never expected to witness someone harass an airline CEO for 30 minutes while demanding to speak to authority. The irony was so perfect it seemed like a movie." Miguel Santos had leveraged his viral live stream into a consulting contract with Altitude Airlines to help develop their social media monitoring systems. His tech company specialized in bias detection algorithms, and Zara had personally recruited him to join her transformation initiative. The beautiful thing about this story, Miguel explained during a CNBC interview, is that it demonstrates how technology can create immediate accountability for discriminatory behavior, Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft couldn't deny her statements or claim they were taken out of context because everything was recorded in high definition by multiple witnesses. Legal scholars were analyzing the case as a perfect example of how digital documentation could strengthen civil rights enforcement. Professor Jennifer Walsh from Harvard Law School published an op-ed in the New York Times titled, "When Cameras Become Witnesses: How Social Media is Transforming Anti-Discrimination Law." The Whitmore-Bancroft incident represents a new paradigm in civil rights documentation, Professor Walsh wrote. Traditional discrimination cases often depend on witness testimony that can be challenged or disputed. But when discriminatory behavior is recorded by multiple sources and distributed to millions of viewers, the evidence becomes incontrovertible. Aviation industry executives were scrambling to assess whether their own companies could survive similar scrutiny if incidents occurred on their aircraft. The stock prices of major airlines were fluctuating based on investor concerns about potential liability from passenger discrimination incidents. United Airlines CEO David Morrison announced during an emergency board meeting that his company would implement enhanced bias training within 60 days. The Altitude Airlines incident has created new industry standards for addressing discrimination, Morrison told reporters. "We cannot afford to be unprepared if similar situations arise on our aircraft." Delta Airlines hired a team of crisis communications specialists to review their existing passenger conduct policies and recommend updates based on the Altitude incident. American Airlines expanded their partnership with civil rights organizations to develop improved training protocols for customer-facing employees. The International Air Transport Association called an emergency meeting of industry executives to discuss uniform standards for addressing passenger discrimination. Zara Williams was invited as the keynote speaker despite being the youngest CEO in the association's history. Ms. Williams has demonstrated that addressing discrimination isn't just morally correct, it's economically smart, IATA President William Thompson announced. Altitude Airlines has experienced unprecedented customer loyalty and positive publicity by taking a strong stance against harassment. Religious leaders were incorporating the incident into Christmas sermons about dignity, respect, and standing up for justice. Reverend Marcus Johnson of the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem delivered a sermon titled "Christmas Dignity: When Angels Wear Hoodies," drawing parallels between Zara's treatment and biblical stories of hospitality and recognition. "Sometimes angels come disguised as ordinary people," Reverend Johnson told his congregation. Zara Williams was treated like an outcast, but she responded with grace that revealed the divine spark in every human being. International media outlets picked up the story as evidence of American progress in addressing racial discrimination. The BBC ran a documentary special titled "Flying While Black How: One Incident Changed an Industry," while Deutsche Welle analyzed the case as an example of how social media could accelerate social justice. Victoria Whitmore-Bancroft's arrest had become a cautionary tale studied by public relations professionals worldwide. Business schools were developing case studies about reputation management in the social media age, using Victoria's spectacular downfall as an example of how quickly privilege could collapse when confronted with accountability. Dr. Patricia Stevens, who taught crisis management at Wharton Business School, assigned her students to analyze the incident for lessons about digital age leadership. The Whitmore-Bancroft case demonstrates that in the social media era, every public interaction is potentially a global broadcast, Dr. Stevens explained. Leaders must understand that their behavior can be instantly judged by millions of people. Technology companies were developing new applications based on the incident, including bias detection software for transportation companies and real-time discrimination reporting platforms for travelers. The market for anti-discrimination technology was projected to grow by 400% over the next 5 years. driven largely by demand created by viral incidents like Flight 847. Mental health professionals were analyzing the psychological impact of instant global accountability on individuals who engaged in discriminatory behavior. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a psychologist who specialized in public shaming research, published a study on digital age consequences, how viral accountability affects individual behavior. What we're seeing with cases like Mrs. Whitmore-Bancroft is immediate comprehensive social rejection for behavior that was previously tolerated or ignored, Dr. Martinez explained. The psychological impact of instant global judgment is unprecedented in human history. The incident had transcended aviation news to become a broader cultural phenomenon that touched on issues of privilege, accountability, dignity, and justice. Christmas Day 2024 would be remembered as the day when a moment of harassment became a catalyst for industry transformation and social change. The Altitude Airlines headquarters in Denver became the epicenter of a corporate transformation that was unprecedented in both scope and speed. Zara Williams had converted the main conference room into a 24-hour war room, where teams of engineers, lawyers, trainers, and executives worked around the clock to implement the Dignity First protocol. The technology infrastructure required to monitor passenger interactions in real time was being developed by a coalition of companies led by Miguel Santos's firm, with support from IBM's Watson AI division and Microsoft's Azure cloud platform. The bias detection algorithms were trained on thousands of hours of recorded airline interactions, learning to identify patterns of discriminatory language and behavior. Dr. Patricia Williams, who oversaw human resources for Altitude Airlines, was coordinating with civil rights organizations to develop the most comprehensive anti-bias training program in corporate America. The curriculum included modules on unconscious bias, cultural competency, conflict, de-escalation, and legal responsibilities under federal anti-discrimination law. We're not just training our employees to avoid discrimination, Dr. Williams explained during a staff meeting. We're training them to actively promote dignity and inclusion in every interaction. The difference is that we're moving from passive compliance to active advocacy. The flight attendant training program was being completely redesigned to emphasize passenger advocacy over conflict avoidance. Sandra Mills, the lead flight attendant from Flight 847, was promoted to Director of Cabin Dignity Services, a new position created specifically to ensure that discriminatory incidents were addressed immediately rather than ignored or minimized. Flight attendants are the front line of passenger protection, Mills explained to her new team. We can't wait for problems to escalate to involve ground supervisors or law enforcement. We have to intervene at the first sign of harassment or discrimination. Captain Elena Vasquez was leading the development of new cockpit protocols that empowered flight crews to remove disruptive passengers more quickly. The traditional airline hierarchy that required multiple approvals for passenger removal was being streamlined to enable immediate action when discrimination occurred. Safety includes emotional safety, Vasquez told a gathering of Altitude pilots. A passenger who is being harassed is not safe, and a passenger who is harassing others is a threat to everyone's well-being. We have to treat discrimination as seriously as we treat mechanical problems. The legal department, under the direction of Jennifer Park, was developing precedent-setting policies for addressing passenger-on-passenger harassment. Traditional airline policies had focused primarily on passenger behavior toward crew members, but the new protocols addressed the full spectrum of discriminatory conduct. We're establishing that creating a hostile environment for other passengers is grounds for immediate removal, Park explained during a legal briefing. Passengers have a right to travel with dignity, and we're going to enforce that right aggressively. Customer service operations were being restructured around dignity metrics rather than efficiency measures. Traditional airline customer service focused on processing complaints quickly. Altitude's new approach focused on resolving complaints thoroughly with attention to underlying bias issues. Marcus Rodriguez, who had been promoted to Director of Dignity Assurance, was developing a customer feedback system that specifically tracked incidents of discrimination and bias. "We're not just asking customers if they were satisfied with their flight," Rodriguez explained. "We're asking if they felt respected, welcomed, and treated with dignity throughout their travel experience." The company's social media strategy was being completely redesigned to emphasize transparency and accountability. Rather than minimizing negative incidents, Altitude committed to publicly addressing discrimination complaints and sharing the corrective actions being taken. "We're going to be the airline that admits mistakes and demonstrates learning," explained social media director Lisa Thompson. "Transparency builds trust, and trust builds loyalty among customers who value dignity and inclusion." Employee compensation structures were being revised to include dignity metrics alongside traditional performance measures. Customer service representatives, gate agents, and flight attendants would receive bonuses based on positive dignity feedback from passengers. "We're putting our money where our values are," explained Chief Financial Officer David Park. "Employees who create inclusive environments will be rewarded financially, and employees who engage in discriminatory behavior will face immediate economic consequences." The company's hiring practices were being overhauled to prioritize candidates who demonstrated commitment to diversity and inclusion. New applicants were required to complete bias assessments and participate in role-playing exercises that tested their responses to discriminatory scenarios. "We're not just hiring people who can do the job," explained Director of Talent Acquisition Maria Santos. "We're hiring people who can do the job while advancing our mission of dignified travel for everyone." Partnership agreements with other airlines were being modified to include dignity standards. Altitude's code-share arrangements now required partner airlines to meet equivalent anti-discrimination standards or risk contract cancellation. "We can't control how other airlines treat passengers," explained Director of Partnerships Robert Chen. "But we can control which airlines we associate our brand with, and we're only partnering with companies that share our commitment to passenger dignity." The aircraft fleet was being retrofitted with enhanced recording capabilities to document passenger interactions for quality assurance and legal protection. The new systems could automatically flag conversations that contained potentially discriminatory language for human review. "Technology is enabling us to identify problems before they become incidents," explained Chief Technology Officer Sandra Mitchell. "We can intervene when passengers begin exhibiting bias rather than waiting for full-scale harassment to occur." Training partnerships were established with major universities to conduct ongoing research into aviation discrimination and develop evidence-based solutions. The University of Denver's Business Ethics Institute was conducting a longitudinal study of Altitude's transformation to document best practices for other companies. "We're treating dignity as a business discipline that requires ongoing research and development," explained Director of Corporate Research Jennifer Walsh. "This isn't a one-time program. It's a permanent commitment to understanding and preventing discrimination." The company's annual report was being restructured to include comprehensive dignity metrics alongside traditional financial measures. Shareholders would receive detailed information about discrimination incidents, training outcomes, and passenger feedback related to inclusive service. "We're demonstrating that companies can be profitable and principled simultaneously," explained Investor Relations Director Michael Harrison. "Our dignity initiatives are generating customer loyalty, employee satisfaction, and positive publicity that directly translates to financial performance." The transformation of Altitude Airlines was being documented by Harvard Business School as a case study in rapid organizational change. Professor Dr. Patricia Stevens was embedding with the company to observe how corporate culture could be modified quickly when leadership was committed to fundamental transformation. "What Zara Williams has accomplished in 6 months typically takes organizations several years," Dr. Stevens observed. "The combination of moral urgency, financial investment, and comprehensive implementation has created a template for how companies can address discrimination effectively." By the 6-month anniversary of the Flight 847 incident, Altitude Airlines had become the gold standard for dignified air travel. Customer satisfaction ratings were at record highs, employee retention had improved dramatically, and the company's stock price had increased by 35% as investors recognized the financial value of ethical leadership. The transformation initiated by Zara Williams at Altitude Airlines created a cascade of changes across the entire aviation industry as competitors scrambled to avoid similar incidents and capitalize on growing customer demand for dignified air travel. Within 60 days of the Flight 847 incident, United Airlines announced the implementation of their Respect in Flight program, which included enhanced bias training for all customer-facing employees and real-time monitoring of passenger interactions. CEO David Morrison publicly credited Zara Williams with raising the bar for how airlines address discrimination and harassment. Delta Airlines partnered with the NAACP and the Anti-Defamation League to develop Sky Equality, a comprehensive anti-discrimination initiative that exceeded federal requirements for bias prevention. The program included passenger education campaigns about respectful travel behavior and immediate consequences for discriminatory conduct. American Airlines created the position of Chief Dignity Officer, hiring civil rights attorney Patricia Rodriguez to oversee the development of industry-leading inclusion policies. The company's Fly with Pride initiative emphasized that air travel should be accessible and comfortable for passengers of all backgrounds. Southwest Airlines leveraged its reputation for friendly service to launch Hearts in the Sky, a program that trained employees to recognize and interrupt discriminatory interactions between passengers. The airline's marketing campaign emphasized that everyone's journey matters and highlighted stories of passengers who had been helped by intervention from Southwest crew members. JetBlue Airways developed partnerships with diversity training organizations to create mandatory monthly workshops for all employees. The airline's Blue Skies for All program included passenger feedback specifically designed to identify and address bias incidents before they escalated to harassment. The International Air Transport Association established new industry standards for addressing passenger discrimination largely based on protocols developed by Altitude Airlines. The IATA Dignity Standards required member airlines to implement bias detection enhanced training programs and immediate consequences for discriminatory behavior. Federal regulators responded to industry changes by updating guidelines for addressing discrimination complaints. The Department of Transportation created new reporting requirements that tracked bias incidents across all airlines and established benchmarks for industry performance on inclusion measures. The Federal Aviation Administration expanded existing regulations to include specific protections against passenger-on-passenger harassment. The new rules empowered flight crews to remove passengers who created hostile environments and established criminal penalties for discriminatory behavior on aircraft. Congressional hearings were held to examine discrimination in transportation industries, with Zara Williams testifying about the need for stronger federal oversight of bias incidents. Her testimony led to bipartisan legislation requiring annual dignity audits for all airlines receiving federal contracts. International aviation authorities adopted similar standards, recognizing that discrimination incidents could damage entire countries' tourism industries. The European Union's Aviation Regulatory Agency implemented dignity requirements for all airlines operating in European airspace. Customer behavior began shifting as travelers increasingly chose airlines based on their inclusion policies rather than just price and schedule convenience. Surveys showed that 73% of passengers were willing to pay premium prices for airlines with strong anti-discrimination records. The industry transformation initiated by a single incident on Flight 847 demonstrated how individual acts of courage could create widespread change when supported by leadership committed to justice and accountability. Logan International Airport buzzed with the familiar chaos of Christmas Eve travel, but the atmosphere in Terminal C felt different from the previous year. Digital displays throughout the terminal featured Altitude Airlines' Dignity First messaging, alongside traditional holiday decorations, creating a subtle but powerful reminder that respectful travel had become the industry standard. Zara Williams walked through the same terminal where her life had changed exactly 1 year earlier, though few passengers would have recognized the confident executive in the tailored navy suit as the young woman in the hoodie who had been harassed at Gate 15. She still wore sneakers, a signature style that had been adopted by young executives across industries, but everything else about her presence radiated the authority she had grown into over 12 months of transformational leadership. The occasion for her return to Boston was the first annual Dignity in Travel Award ceremony, where Zara would present recognition to passengers, crew members, and airline personnel who had demonstrated exceptional commitment to inclusive service. The ceremony had become a marquee event for the aviation industry, with executives from around the world attending to celebrate progress in creating respectful travel experiences. Gate 15 had been renovated during the summer and now featured a permanent installation commemorating the Flight 847 incident. A simple plaque read, "In honor of all travelers who have faced discrimination and all witnesses who refused to remain silent. May every journey be marked by dignity and respect." The installation had become an informal pilgrimage site for travelers who wanted to pay their respects to the moment when aviation began changing for the better. Miguel Santos, now Director of Social Justice Technology at Altitude Airlines, was documenting the anniversary for a documentary about corporate transformation in the digital age. His original live stream from Flight 847 had been viewed over 200 million times across all platforms, making it the most watched aviation incident in history. Standing here exactly 1 year later, Miguel said to his camera, "It's remarkable to see how one moment of harassment became a catalyst for industry-wide transformation." Zara Williams turned personal attack into corporate purpose, and the results speak for themselves. The statistics were indeed remarkable. Altitude Airlines had reported record customer satisfaction ratings with dignity-related metrics exceeding traditional service measures in passenger surveys. Employee retention had increased by 40%, while bias incidents had decreased by 85%. The company's stock price had doubled as investors recognized the financial value of ethical leadership. Rachel Martinez, now a senior at the University of Denver studying business ethics and social justice, had leveraged her viral documentation of the incident into a career in digital advocacy. Her TikTok account, which focused on holding corporations accountable for discriminatory behavior, had grown to over 5 million followers who looked to her for analysis of viral justice moments. This anniversary isn't just about celebrating what happened to one Karen who picked the wrong target, Rachel explained during an interview with NBC News. It's about recognizing that ordinary people with phones have the power to create accountability for behavior that was previously ignored or tolerated. David Cohen had transitioned from divorce law to civil rights advocacy, inspired by his witness experience on Flight 847. His legal practice now specialized in aviation discrimination cases, and he had successfully litigated dozens of incidents that had been documented by passenger videos. The Whitmore-Bancroft case changed how we approach discrimination evidence, Cohen explained to his law students during a guest lecture at Boston University. When harassment is recorded by multiple witnesses and distributed to millions of viewers, denial becomes impossible and justice becomes inevitable. Sarah Thompson had become an unlikely advocate for digital age activism, speaking at conferences about the responsibility older generations had to support younger people who documented injustice. Her response to the Flight 847 incident had made her a symbol of intergenerational solidarity in fighting discrimination. "Young people today are braver than we ever were," Sarah told an audience at the AARP convention. "They don't just hope that someone in authority will address injustice. They create their own authority by bearing witness and sharing truth." Captain Elena Vasquez had been promoted to Chief of Flight Operations at Altitude Airlines, where she oversaw implementation of dignity protocols across the entire fleet. Her military background and calm leadership during the original incident had made her the ideal executive to ensure that similar situations would be handled with both professionalism and principle. The anniversary also marked the completion of Altitude's technology transformation. Every aircraft in the fleet now featured AI-powered bias detection that could identify potentially discriminatory language and alert crew members to intervene before harassment escalated. The technology had been licensed to over 30 airlines worldwide, creating industry standards for passenger protection. As Christmas Eve 2025 drew to a close, the aviation industry had been fundamentally transformed by a single moment of courage in the face of discrimination. Flight 847 had become more than just a travel incident. It had become a symbol of how individual dignity could reshape entire industries when supported by leadership committed to justice. The private memorial service that Zara Williams held for her father on Christmas morning 2025 was attended by the same witnesses who had supported her during the most difficult moment of her life. In a conference room overlooking Boston Harbor, she gathered with Miguel Santos, Rachel Martinez, David Cohen, Sarah Thompson, and Captain Elena Vasquez to reflect on a year that had transformed personal trauma into corporate purpose. My father always believed that the best way to honor someone's memory was to continue their work, Zara told the small group gathered around the table where she had placed her father's leather journal alongside photos from the previous year's achievements. I spent this year learning that healing doesn't come from avoiding pain, it comes from transforming pain into purpose. The grief that had driven Zara to wear her father's hoodie on that December flight had evolved into a different kind of emotional weight, the responsibility of leadership in an industry that touched millions of lives every day. She had learned to carry both sorrow and success, understanding that personal loss could fuel professional transformation without defining it. Dr. Patricia Stevens, the Harvard Business School professor who had studied Altitude's transformation, had interviewed Zara extensively about the psychological aspects of leadership under pressure. What's remarkable about Zara's response to harassment, Dr. Stevens explained in her published research, is that she never allowed victimization to become her identity. Instead, she used the experience as evidence for why change was necessary. The therapy sessions that Zara had begun after her father's death had continued throughout the year, but the focus had shifted from processing grief to managing the psychological pressures of public leadership. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, her therapist, had helped her understand that healing from both personal loss and public trauma required different strategies. Zara learned to separate her personal healing from her professional responsibilities. Dr. Walsh explained during a conference on leadership psychology. She understood that her individual experience of discrimination was important, but her response to it had to serve purposes larger than personal vindication. The relationship Zara had developed with the witnesses from Flight 847 had become a unique form of extended family people bound together by shared commitment to justice rather than blood or marriage. Miguel, Rachel, David, Sarah, and Elena had remained close advisors throughout her first year as CEO, providing perspective that balanced business considerations with human dignity. What we witnessed on that flight created a bond that goes beyond typical professional relationships, Sarah Thompson explained during a panel discussion about intergenerational activism. We became a chosen family, united by our commitment to ensuring that what happened to Zara never happens to another traveler. The hoodie that Zara had worn during the incident had been donated to the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture, where it was displayed alongside other artifacts from significant civil rights moments. The decision to share such a personal item had been difficult, but Zara understood that her father's sweater had become a symbol that belonged to history rather than just family. Letting go of the hoodie was like letting go of my need to carry my father's memory as a burden, Zara explained during the Smithsonian donation ceremony. I realized that the best way to honor him was to wear his values rather than his clothes. The leadership style that Zara had developed combined her father's commitment to dignity with her own generation's understanding of how technology could accelerate social change. She had learned to be both vulnerable and authoritative, personal and professional, grieving and growing simultaneously. Zara represents a new kind of CEO, explained Professor Michael Harrison, who taught leadership studies at Northwestern University. She understands that authentic leadership in the digital age requires transparency about personal struggles alongside competence in professional responsibilities. The year had taught Zara that healing was not a destination, but a process that required ongoing commitment to growth learning and service. She had transformed from a recent MBA graduate, struggling with inherited responsibility, into an industry leader whose approach to corporate ethics was being studied by business schools worldwide. "I learned that you don't have to be perfect to be a leader," Zara told the group gathered for her father's memorial. "You just have to be committed to becoming better, and you have to create environments where other people can become better too." The final chapter of the Flight 847 story was written not in boardrooms or courtrooms, but in the everyday experiences of millions of travelers who discovered that air travel could be dignified, respectful, and inclusive. The incident that had begun with one woman's prejudice had evolved into a movement that touched every aspect of commercial aviation. As Zara Williams prepared to board her return flight to Denver on Christmas Day 2025, the same route that had changed her life exactly 1 year earlier, she carried with her more than just personal belongings. She carried the hopes of every traveler who had ever been made to feel unwelcome, the gratitude of every airline employee who now felt empowered to protect passenger dignity, and the legacy of a father who had believed that transportation could be a force for human connection rather than division. The aircraft she boarded was operated by Delta Airlines, one of dozens of carriers that had licensed Altitude's Dignity technology and implemented similar passenger protection protocols. The flight attendant who welcomed her aboard was a graduate of the industry's first certified anti-bias training program. The passengers around her were traveling in an environment where harassment based on race appearance or assumptions about economic status had become both socially unacceptable and professionally sanctioned. "Good evening and welcome aboard," announced Captain Jennifer Rodriguez during the pre-flight safety briefing. "We want to remind all passengers that this aircraft is a respectful space where every traveler has the right to journey with dignity. We appreciate your cooperation in maintaining an environment where everyone feels welcome." The announcement, which had become standard across the industry, represented more than corporate policy. It represented a fundamental shift in how aviation understood its responsibility to protect passenger welfare beyond physical safety. Victoria Whitmore-Bancroft's name had become synonymous with the consequences of entitled racism, studied in business ethics courses and cited in discrimination training materials. Her spectacular downfall served as a reminder that in the digital age, prejudice could no longer hide behind polite codes or private spaces. But the true legacy of Flight 847 was not punishment for past behavior. It was prevention of future harm. The technology training and cultural changes that had emerged from that 30-minute confrontation were protecting travelers every day, ensuring that dignity was no longer a luxury, but a standard feature of air travel. As the aircraft lifted off from Logan International Airport, Zara Williams looked out the window at the city lights below and opened her father's journal to a passage she had read countless times over the past year. The measure of a company's character is not how it treats customers who look like executives, but how it treats travelers who look like they might need assistance, kindness, or simply basic human respect. The young woman who had been told she didn't belong in first class had not only reclaimed her seat, she had redefined what first class meant for everyone who followed her into the sky. True first class, she had learned, was not about the price of your ticket or the brand of your bag. It was about the recognition that every person who boards an aircraft is someone's most precious cargo, deserving of dignity, respect, and the basic humanity that makes civilization possible. The aircraft climbed toward cruising altitude, carrying passengers who understood that they were traveling not just through physical space, but through a transformed industry where justice had learned to fly. In the year since Flight 847, Zara Williams had proven that quiet dignity could indeed change everything. She had taken her father's principles and amplified them through technology training and transparent leadership that made discrimination impossible to ignore and accountability impossible to avoid. The flight was over, but the journey toward justice would continue with every passenger who chose dignity over prejudice, every crew member who protected rather than ignored harassment, and every witness who refused to remain silent when basic human respect was under attack. The sky Zara Williams had proven truly did belong to everyone who dared to soar with grace. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that quiet strength can change the world. Subscribe to our channel because every week we bring you more stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when they choose dignity over prejudice. Your support helps us continue sharing these important messages about justice, respect, and the power we all have to make a difference. Thank you for watching, and remember that every interaction is an opportunity to treat someone with the dignity they deserve. Until next time, keep flying with grace.